Hello, today on my channel you will hear an amazing story about life. I hope you enjoy this story. This one struck me to the core. Honestly, I still can't forget it. Enjoy watching.
The autumn wind swirled the fallen leaves as if cradling them in its arms. Lexi walked down the street, passing noisy avenues and gray high-rises. The wind ruffled her brown hair, making it tangle in her thin wool jacket. The heels of her shoes clattered on the wet asphalt, beating a rhythm of anxiety in her heart. Each step was hard to take, for ahead of her lay the trial, the divorce, the fight for justice and the memory of the man who had become her family, Edward, her husband's father. Lexi tried not to think about what awaited her in the courtroom. She knew that Edward and his overbearing mother would stop at nothing to disinherit her. So she knew they would lie and accuse her of all the deadly sins. Finally, Lexi hesitantly stopped at the entrance to the building. The heavy oak doors with massive metal handles creaked open, letting her guest into a rather gloomy long hallway. Lexi took a deep breath, trying to deal with the rising panic. There was a tense silence in the hall, interrupted only by the quiet whispers of lawyers counseling their clients. Lexi, as if mesmerized, walked to her seat, passing the tables littered with papers. It was then that she saw Edward and his mother. Her husband looked glum and tense, his face contorted with anger. Janie, on the other hand, radiated cold confidence. Her lips were pressed into a thin line and her eyes were full of contempt. Next to them sat a woman Lexi recognized immediately, Isabel Korshunova, the photo model and Edward's lover. Her bouffant blonde hair, bright makeup, and provocative dress contrasted sharply with the strict and formal courtroom attire. At that moment, Lexi remembered how she had once caught Edward in Isabel's arms in their living room when she had returned from work late one evening after a long surgery. Tears filled her eyes. Her soul was torn apart. Edward explained to her, as if nothing had happened, in a tone that brooked no objection, that he had long since fallen out of love with her, and now he had a new lady of the heart. Those words, like shards of broken glass, cut into her heart forever, leaving a deep, unhealing wound. Lexi felt a wave of uneasy shivers run down her spine as she met her eyes with her ex-husband. Edward grinned and said in a half voice, "Look for your inheritance in the dump. You'll get nothing here." She was taken aback and froze in place. Naomi said quietly, "Attorney Bob, please come to the table." Lexi obediently sat down and immediately felt the stares of those present, as if she were not a person but a museum piece. At the hearing as the dissolution of the marriage between Lexi Smith and Edward Reshetnikoff, the judge began, as well as the division of the property left behind by the late Edward Reshetnikoff, specifically his business and land located within the city limits. The judge's voice was even, expressing neither sympathy nor condemnation. "Your Honor," Edward's attorney said, "we believe Lexi Smith is not entitled to the inheritance." "Why not entitled?" Lexi couldn't help herself. "Because M. Smith," the lawyer continued and pointed at Lexi with an accusing gesture, "performed a botched surgery on her father-in-law, Edward, and it was her actions that caused my client's father's conditions, was interior." "That's a lie," Lexi exclaimed. "Edward had been sick for a long time, and I did everything I could to save him." "Stop playing with words, dearie," Janie said, and looked at her with disdain. "You know perfectly well your interest in the operation was not so much medical as self-serving." "Are you saying I eliminated my father-in-law for money?" Lexi asked. "Exactly," Edward confirmed. Naomi, frowning, asked, "Lexi, can you provide medical documentation to support the claim that you did everything you could?" "Of course. After all, it's been at least 6 months since the surgery I had. And if I'd done anything wrong, Edward wouldn't have lasted 24 hours, Lexi replied. An indignant murmur ran through the room. Immediately after her words, the lawyer handed the judge a folder of medical documents. The judge studied the documents, then raised his head and looked at her. "Lexi," the judge continued, "everything in these documents looks quite credible, but there is one but. It is a doctor's ethical obligation to inform the patient of all the risks of the surgery and that, although it was successful, If the patient has comorbidities, it is not always possible to avoid the risk of complications that could later cause Edward's death. Have you informed him of this? Yes, Your Honor, Lexi replied. I explained everything to Edward in detail, all the risks. And he still agreed to the surgery, even though he knew that every doctor in town refused to perform it. The judge clarified. Yes, Lexi replied quietly. Edward was well aware that he had no choice, especially since the surgery gave him another 6 months to live, and in his position, that was no small thing. Please provide evidence for your claim, the judge said. Your Honor, Lexi's attorney interjected. As evidence, we are going to introduce an audio recording of a conversation between Lexi and Edward where my client talks about all the risks and getting consent. Okay, let's listen to that recording. And there was silence in the room, and soon the conversation was replayed. Lexi's voice sounded calm and confident. As she explained the specifics of the disease and the possible risks of the surgery, Edward listened attentively, asking questions that Lexi readily explained. At the end, his calm, confident voice said, I understand, Lexi, and I trust you. But do whatever you think is right. Well, the judge said when the tape ended, that fundamentally changes the case. Well, Janie whispered. Very interesting. Mom, what do we do next? Edward perked up. We'll see, son, we'll see. Your Honor, Edward's attorney intervened again. We believe that the audio recording is not proof that the operation was done correctly. That's a lie too, Lexi exclaimed. It wasn't my fault, and I didn't wish Edward anything but good health. Oh, come on, came a voice from the audience. The judge said grudgingly, please calm down, keep order. There was an oppressive silence in the hall. Lexi could feel her face burning with shame and anger. It seemed that everyone around her, the judge, the lawyers, Edward, Janie, and Isabel, was enjoying her misery. Meanwhile, skillfully seizing the moment, the spouse's attorney began his opening statement, laying out his intention to disinherit Lexi from the inheritance left to her by Edward's late father, Edward Sir. Your Honor, in addition to conducting the operation itself, Lexi was tasked with caring for my client's father during his illness. However, not only did she fail in her duty, but she was negligent and neglected her duties. Lexi was stunned. She had devoted the last 3 years of her life to caring for Edward Sir, who had been diagnosed with a rare and extremely dangerous disease that required not only surgical intervention, but also competent drug therapy. We are prepared to present evidence, the attorney continued with a smirk, that will prove that Lexi repeatedly left Edward Sir unattended, which led to frequent falls and micro-injuries. In addition, she has been extremely irresponsible with his finances, squandering significant funds on personal expenses. There was a pause for a moment. Then there was timid applause. It was Isabel and Janie anticipating triumph, expressing their admiration for Edward and the whole process. The judge frowned, then tapped his gavel. Lexi felt her heart clench with pain. The accusations were completely unfounded. After all, she very rarely left Edward Sir alone, and all of her financial transactions were thoroughly documented. After waiting for silence to return to the room, Lexi's attorney stood up and immediately issued a rebuttal, detailing her devotion to the late Edward Smith, who had once been a friend of her father's. All of these allegations are malicious lies concocted for the sole purpose of leaving my client without the inheritance that is rightfully hers under the will of the deceased, Bob summarized. Had he shocked the audience, but the last word had to be said by someone with special power and authority. So in that case, in view of all the newly discovered circumstances of the case, the court adjourns for 2 weeks, the judge announced and tapped his gavel. Court is adjourned. Janie flashed a grudging smile and was the first to head for the exit. Edward and his new girlfriend followed, their faces clearly showing their disappointment at the postponement. Lexi and Bob were the only ones who felt they'd won a small victory in the form of a 2-week postponement. Don't feel bad, Helena. Everything will be fine. At least now we know what's on your husband's mind, the lawyer said outside. She nodded in agreement. As Lexi watched the trio of Edward, Isabel, and Janie drive away in a luxury car, she said, "Thank you, Bob. I should probably get going. Otherwise, I still have work to do." Lexi snickered with a guilty face. "You're welcome. Call me anytime and get ready for a reconsideration." The lawyer said goodbye and, touching his client's shoulder in confidence, headed for his car. Lexi, on the other hand, wanted to walk to unwind a bit and try to recover before her shift. She lifted her head, gazing up into the frowning sky. It hadn't started raining yet, but the air was already filled with a premonition of it, just as her soul felt the inevitability of future disappointments. Lexi walked, immersed in her thoughts. Fragments of the past related to Edward Sturr swirled in her mind. A kind man with a gruff but surprisingly accommodating voice, who was always ready to help. Edward Sturr was a passionate man whose life was filled with ideas along with projects that he saw as his messages to the future. As an engineer by training, he dreamed of turning the city dump into a source of clean energy. Thus, in the unrealized plans of Edward Sturr was a modern waste recycling plant that could not only solve the problem of pollution, but also give a second life to some of the waste. No one believes in that, and Helena said he sighs and stares off into the distance. Everyone laughs, but I know his feelings. This is going to be a great thing. It's my legacy. Lexi smiled, remembering her father-in-law's burning eyes and his unquenchable passion for his work. He was a perfectionist, putting all his heart and energy into a project. Edward Sturr spent hours with his daughter-in-law, talking about new technologies and his own inventions that had not yet been patented. But most of all, he dreamed of the day when his mill would be the pride of the town. "I feel that Edward should carry on my business," said his father. "He is a smart boy and is sure to realize the importance of the business." But unfortunately, Edward never shared his father's enthusiasm. He was interested in other things: money, fame, pleasure. Edward Sturr had hoped that his love for his son would ignite in him a spark of interest in his work. But he'd been wrong. Lexi remembered well how she had tried to explain to Edward the importance of his father's project, how she'd told her husband about the technology, about the opportunities that lay ahead of them. But Edward didn't want to listen. He was only interested in quick money and immediate success. "Honey, understand your daddy dreamed of keeping his business alive," Lexi said at her father-in-law's funeral. "He put so much work into it, and let's try to make his dream come true." But her husband only shook his head and smiled his cold smile. In his eyes, Lexi didn't see an ounce of respect for her father's memory. "You don't know anything about business. You're a doctor, and that says it all. You know how it is, to each his own. Yes, my father in the 90s made the initial capital, opened a business thanks to his inventions. But this is a different time. That's why it's all nonsense. It's a project no one needs. It's better to sell the land and invest the money in something more profitable. It's not for nothing that your father bequeathed this land and some of the equipment of his mini mill to you," he said. Lexi froze in place as if struck by lightning. Her heart clenched. Couldn't Edward realize even now how important this business was to his father? Couldn't he at least try to realize his dream? After all, now that Edward Sturr was gone, everything stopped. Innovative developments, patents promising cooperation with foreign investors, everything was abandoned. But Edward and Janie showed no interest in the business. Lexi entered the subway as if it were a refuge from the cruel world. The crowd of people rushing about their business seemed foreign and hostile to her. She pressed herself against the cold wall of the car, closed her eyes, and tried to pull herself away from the memories that came flooding back. Lexi remembered vividly the day Edward Sturr had been hospitalized in her ward. The diagnosis had been disappointing: a tumor in his abdomen, metastasized to his liver. He looked weak and thin, and there was anxiety in his eyes. "Don't worry, Edward," Lexi said with difficulty, trying to hide the worry in her voice. "We'll do our best." The doctors gathered in a concilium were discussing the risks and complexities of the surgery. "Yes, a severe case," Professor Aaron, the head of the department, said glumly. "The tumor is located dangerously close to important vessels. The risk of bleeding is extremely high. Lexi, are you ready to take responsibility for this surgery?" "Ready," she replied firmly. "I've reviewed all the data, analyzed the possible risks, and we can handle it." Her confidence, brilliant knowledge, and experience then convinced everyone. There was a tense silence in the operating room. The assistants, the nurses, everyone was focused on their duties. Lexi stood at the operating table, her sterile gloved hands trembling slightly. The complicated surgery had lasted several hours, making her feel as if time had stopped. "Well there, we won. It was a success," Lexi finally said, smiling tiredly after putting in the last stitches. "The patient is in stable condition." The next day, Edward Surdot's condition stabilized. He was slowly on the mend. Lexi visited him often, inquiring about his well-being, telling him the latest news. In turn, Edward Sir never stopped thanking her for saving him. "Helena, you gave me a chance. I believed in you from the beginning," Edward Sir began then. His voice was quieter than usual. "But what are you?" "I was only doing my job," Helena brushed it off. "I wanted to talk to you about something important." Lexi froze, looking closely at Edward's father-in-law. "He's not my birth son." Those words sounded like thunder. Lexi felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean?" she whispered, not believing what she was hearing. Edward Storr sighed sadly and, pulling himself together, continued. "He was found as an infant in a wooded area, wrapped in an old blanket. No papers, nothing. My wife and I, anyway. The pregnancy was terminated again, you know. We just couldn't leave him alone, so we decided to adopt." Lexi was silent, trying to comprehend what she was hearing. The world around her seemed to dissolve, leaving only those words, like icy shards piercing her soul. "And why are you only telling me this now?" she asked. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "I wanted Edward to find out for himself when he was ready," Edward Sir replied. "But I couldn't stand it. I needed you to know. You're part of our family, Lexi, and as such, you have a right to know the truth." "Does Edward know?" Lexi asked. "No, I was afraid it would hurt him and that he wouldn't understand. I didn't want my son to feel unwanted, abandoned. I love him like family, after all." "I always will," Edward Sir replied. Lexi felt like her world was falling apart. "It's his story," she said a little audibly. "Does he need to know the truth?" "I understand. But please, let's wait. We'll talk to him when he's ready." Lexi nodded, unable to utter a word. That day in the operating room, where she'd performed complex statutory surgeries, her fingers performed the familiar motions on automatic, and she felt her eyes burning, but she kept her emotions under control. "I found him unconscious on the penultimate step," Edward said. Lexi hurried to the exit, not yet knowing that this call would change her life forever. She arrived at Edward Surdot's house and found him in the state of a severe coma. The patient had been unconscious for some time, the ER doctor said. There is a suggestion that he had a stroke. Sadly, Edward Sturr never woke up, and a few days later he was gone. "He died of cardiac arrest," said the doctor who came to examine the patient, but his health condition after the operation was quite stable. However, it cannot be ruled out that the stroke was related to the consequences of the surgery. Lexi felt depressed. She realized that she had done everything she could to save her father-in-law's life, yet she had failed to keep him safe after the surgery. "It was just an accident," she mentally repeated. "Edward Sturr fell down the stairs. It wasn't my fault." However, Edward and Janie didn't believe in accidents and immediately found a reason to blame. "You're a murderer," Edward said. "You wanted the inheritance and willfully performed a bad surgery on my father." Those words hurt Lexi to the core. She couldn't believe that people who seemed close to her were capable of such baseness. Lexi stared out the window of the subway car. Images of the past flashed before her eyes. Edward Surdot's face, his grateful eyes, the tense faces of his co-workers in the operating room, and finally, a face contorted with anger. She got off at Medgorodok station, struggling to hold back tears. She needed to go to work, to her patients, to her life, which was now turned upside down. In the hallway of the clinic, Lexi met Helena. The older nurse had always been kind, caring, and in some ways had become Lexi's true friend at work. "Ah, Lexi, what's wrong with you? Pale as a sheet," Helena asked anxiously. "It's okay," Lexi tried to smile. But it didn't work, just didn't get enough sleep. The nurse took her hand. "I can see something's wrong. Tell me." Don't keep a load on your mind, Helena said. So Lexi took a deep breath and laid it all out as it was. About the trial, about her husband's betrayal, about Janie and the charges against her. It's just awful, Helena said, but don't despair, we'll help. Remember, you're not alone. Already in her office, Lexi took a deep breath and tried to pull herself together. She needed to finally get her mind off her problems and get to work. Next patient, the nurse told Lexi, Aaron. A middle-aged man with a concerned look on his face walked into the office. Hello, he said. I'm here for a consultation. I've been having intermittent abdominal pain. Yes, please elaborate, Lexi said, trying to focus. At that moment, a man burst into the emergency room holding a child who, from the looks of it, was unconscious. The boy's face was pale. His lips were blue and blood was oozing from a wound on his thigh, soaking the fabric of his t-shirt and his father's hands. Doctor, someone please help, shouted the man, breaking through the crowd that had instantly gathered around him. My son fell off his bike. Lexi quickly left the office, realizing the matter was serious. Calm down. What's your name? She asked, examining the boy. How did he fall? Where? What hurts? I don't know, the man whispered. My name is Eden. Amin's son was just going down a slide, didn't control it, and hit himself. Lexi nodded and gave a curt command to the nurses, quick gurney, and please have a bleeding stop kit ready. Soon the boy was placed and Lexi, holding his head, continued her examination. Amin, she began, as if imprinting the name into her memory. Can you hear me, Amin? Open your eyes. He didn't respond. Breathing shallow and intermittent, pulse weak, said the nurse, who had already prepared an instrument to take his blood pressure. Lexi continued to quickly examine the wound. Get an electrocardiogram, okay? The nurse had already started hooking up the equipment. Eden, Lexi turned to her father. Can you tell me if Eamon is allergic to any medications? No, to nothing. The man answered with confidence. Good. Lexi quickly assessed the depth of the wound. Thankfully, no vital vessels were affected, basically a scratch. And actually, it's not as bad as it looks. Don't worry, we'll do what we can. And what will you do? Eden asked. We're going to do a little surgery, said Lexi. I'm sorry, but there's no way without it. And surgery now. What if Ammon gets worse? Eden exclaimed and clung to her arm. But Lexi smiled and assured the young father that the injury was not life-threatening, and the surgery would be reduced to the application of a special patch. Pulses improved, reported the nurse monitoring the boy's condition. Good, Lexi said, keep monitoring. Everything's going to be fine. The boy was just scared. That happens sometimes. He's a kid, after all. A lot of people get into trouble at that age. Thank you, Eden whispered after the procedure was over. Thank you for everything. Lexi was visibly embarrassed, and it also made her feel good to know that she'd been able to help, having once chosen the right profession, one that saved both health and lives. It was the most valuable thing she had right now. She smiled softly. It's my job. There's no need for thanks. What's important is that Eamon is healthy. But Eden, under the strong impression of his experience, was in no hurry to leave. He felt he needed to talk, to share with someone the weight of the past few years. And Lexi, against her will, had instilled confidence in him. I'm sorry, he said in a broken voice. I just don't know how to express my gratitude to you. Lexi nodded, inviting him to share his story. She sat down in a chair against the wall and gestured for Eden to sit across from her. Have a seat, I'm listening to you. Eden sat down in the chair and suddenly felt fatigue come over him. He felt several years of tension spilling out like a burst dam. Silence fell, broken only by the quiet noise of cars outside the window. Lexi remained silent, giving him time to gather his thoughts. I don't know where to start, Eden whispered in a quiet, slightly hoarse voice. We'll start with what's most important to you. Lexi suggested softly. Eden slowly raised his eyes, and Lexi saw the bottomless depth of sadness in them. My wife Isabel left when Eamon was very young. The fontanel hadn't closed yet, and I was left alone. It was difficult from the beginning. I didn't know how to swaddle, how to soothe, how to understand his crying. I was working weekends, grabbed every opportunity I could just to feed my son. "But you did manage, I see?" Lexi asked. "Cope somehow. But it was years of loneliness, sleepless nights, constant fatigue. I wanted Eamon to feel loved, protected. I dreamed of him having everything I didn't have as a child. I tried to be both father and mother to him. I cooked, washed, cleaned, played, read stories, all by myself." At that moment, Eden's voice shook, and he clenched his fists, as if trying to hold back a surge of emotion. There were times I snapped. Sometimes I was as afraid I wouldn't make it. But I had no right to give up. A man is all I have. He's my life, my hope, my meaning. Lexi listened without interrupting. She was well aware of how hard her father's journey had been. "And how is Eamon? Does he remember Mom?" Lexi asked after a long pause. "I guess he remembers." Eden smiled sadly. "He was just a baby when Isabel was still visiting us. But sometimes in moments like today, I see in his eyes as if he too is afraid of something he doesn't understand, as if he senses I'm not like other fathers." "He feels your love," Lexi said confidently. "And that's the most important thing. He also sees how hard you work for him. You're a real hero to your son, no doubt about it." Eden looked at the doctor for a long moment, as if trying to find confirmation of his own doubts in her words. "I thought I was supposed to be different from my son. I saw other fathers playing with their kids, spending time with their families. And with us, it's different. It's just me and Eamon." "Well, there's no such thing as perfect parents," Lexi pointed out calmly. "Everyone makes mistakes." In that moment, she saw the words of encouragement slowly creep into Eden's heart, and his tense shoulders relaxed a little. What if her father faltered? What if he starts asking questions about his mother, about why she left? And I don't know what to tell him. And I don't want to hurt him with what I say. "Well, in my opinion, you can answer all the questions honestly," Lexi said, walking over to the window. "Tell him how much you love him, how much you cared for him. Explain that sometimes people make mistakes and things don't work out the way we plan. But the most important thing is that he can always count on your love and support. To be honest with your son and he will understand." Eden nodded slowly. His eyes glistened with tears. "Thank you. You are the only person who has listened to my story without judgment. But I have faith in you and in Eamon," she smiled. "You are a real family, and you will definitely be happy." A sweet smile played on Eden's lips. His mood had improved considerably, and the incident with her son's fall no longer seemed like a big deal. Eden left, thanking the clinic staff for their help. The end of the shift was quietly approaching, and soon Lexi was on her way out after changing her clothes. She'd been living in the suburbs in a rented apartment, where cats were noisy at night, and the neighbors were always having parties with breaking dishes and fights. But today everything was different. It was as if life's problems had come together and decided to give Lexi a little break. Tonight passed almost unnoticed. True, only in the morning she had a dream about her late grandmother Zena, who for some reason stood at the edge of the city dump and looked somewhere in the distance with a blank stare up at the mountains of garbage. Why was she having this dream? Lexi didn't understand, and what was the point of puzzling over it if every dreamer interprets what she saw in a different way? The morning in the surgical ward started as usual, with that pleasant aroma of coffee at the duty nurse's station and the more pungent smell of chlorine. A little later, the corridors were filled with the quiet footsteps of nurses and the muffled conversation of doctors. But in the room where little Eamon lay, there was a special atmosphere, warm, bright, full of childlike spontaneity and hope. Lexi, rested after a busy shift, came to visit her little patient. She entered the room with a smile and froze a few meters away from the bed. Eamon watched her with obvious interest in his eyes. "Hello," she said in a cheerful voice. "Good morning," whispered Eamon, blushing slightly. "How are you feeling?" Lexi asked, coming closer. Lexi sat down on a chair and started talking to the little patient, asking simple but interesting questions. "Do you like cars?" she asked, noticing the toy model truck Eamon kept in his pants pocket. He nodded, embarrassed. "What other cars do you like?" Lexi continued. "Big and red," exclaimed the boy, and his eyes sparkled with joy. "That's great. You know, I like red cars too," said the doctor, smiling. "And I can also draw. Would you like me to draw you a red car?" Eamon's eyes widened with delight. "Sure. Lexi picked up the notebook and pencils that were in the nightstand and started drawing. She drew a bright red car speeding down a road surrounded by green trees. "Here," she said, holding out the notebook. The boy looked at the drawing with delight. "Wow, it's beautiful," he exhaled. "Do you want me to tell you the story of this car?" Lexi offered. "Yes, I do." And this car lived in a magical forest. It had very powerful engines that made it fly and helped all the animals that lived in the forest. One day it met a little bunny who was lost. After such an intriguing introduction, Lexi began to tell the story, portraying the animals, using vivid imagery and intonation. Ammon listened with bated breath, his gaze following every movement of her lips, absorbing her every word. And then the car helped the little bunny to find his mom, and everyone was very happy, and then they had a feast. Ammon, fascinated by the story, smiled dreamily. "Can there be more?" he asked. "Okay," Lexi smiled. Then Lexi took out a brightly colored book with pictures of animals from the nightstand. "Let's read," she suggested, opening the book. Lexi read slowly, expressively, picking up the intonation for each character. Amin listened to her with great interest, looking at the colorful pictures. "Look, an elephant," said Lexi, pointing her finger at a picture with huge ears and a trunk. "Trunk," Amin repeated, looking at the picture. "And this is a giraffe. He has a very long neck so that he can get the tastiest leaves from the tallest trees." Amin listened as if mesmerized. He was literally mesmerized by her voice and her ability to immerse him in the wonderful world of history and animals. "And this is a lion," Lexi said, pointing to the fearsome predator, the king of the beasts. Amin laughed and mimed a growl. Lexi laughed along with him. She was incredibly pleased to see Ammon perk up and his eyes fill with joy. She realized that she had found an approach to this vulnerable little boy, who had been deprived of the warmth of a mother's arms practically since birth. "You know, Ammon," she said, "you are a very good boy. You have a good heart. Soon you'll get well and you'll be able to run and play again." "Won't you?" he asked, and his eyes filled with hope. "Well, yes," Lexi confirmed. "I'll come over every day and we'll draw, read, and tell stories." "Thank you." "You're welcome. I'm glad I can help you," Lexi said. She sat with him some more, telling stories, showing pictures. The little patient was completely enchanted by her attention and care. "Aunt Lexi," Ammon asked suddenly, "will you be my mom?" She was a little confused. "Probably not, buddy. I can't be your mom, but I'll take care of you while you're in the hospital. I'll be your good fairy who helps everyone who needs it." "So a good fairy," Ammon repeated, and his eyes sparkled. "Of course you are," Lexi said, smiling. "Stella's known to always take care of children and help them." "Good. Be my fairy then," Ammon agreed. Lexi, after staying in the room for a while longer, went out and was met by a nurse in the hallway. "He's so excited," Megan said with a slight smile. "He's such a sweet boy. I think we'll make friends with him," the doctor replied. Lexi, as she headed to the restroom, felt like the day was just beginning. She realized that Ammon was a special child who needed care and attention. Lexi visited him every day. The baby was eagerly waiting for the good fairy from the clinic to come and tell her about his dreams and plans for the future. "I want to grow up and drive a big red truck. I'm going to drive sand to the construction site to build beautiful houses," he shared. Lexi listened attentively and supported him. She drew houses and trucks with him. Of course, she understood that she could not replace her mom, but at the same time she became a real friend for him, a person who would always support and help. Lexi watched Ammon become more confident, a spark of joy in his eyes again. One day, as she was reading him another story, Eden walked into the room. "Good afternoon, Helena," he said, smiling. "Thank you again for saving my son Damien. He's doing wonderfully well at your place. I'm glad he's feeling better." Eden stood for a moment in the room, then somehow hesitantly turned to her in a low voice. "Lexi, I'd like to take you to dinner. A small cafe in the center of town. This is my way of thanking you for taking care of my son." Lexi was a little confused. "Thank you for the invitation. It's my pleasure," she replied and smiled. "Great. Wednesday at 7 p.m. Would that work for you? Eden asked. Wednesday at 7 p.m. Will be fine, Lexi confirmed. Eden said goodbye to Lexi and Ammon and left the room. The doctor looked at the boy. He was smiling with a sly squint of his eye. "And I'm going out to dinner with your dad," Lexi said. "That's great," Ammon replied. On Wednesday night, as agreed, Lexi arrived at the cafe. Even though Eden looked a little worried, his eyes shone with joy. "Hello," he said, getting up from the table. "Thank you for coming." "Hello," Lexi replied, smiling. The young men settled in and almost immediately switched to you in conversation. Eden ordered dinner and they began to talk casually about everything. They talked about many things: work, life, Amina. To her surprise, Lexi learned a lot about Eden, especially when she realized that he wasn't what he seemed at first. He was a kind, sensitive man who loves his son very much. Working as a mechanic at a machine shop, he was adept at almost any kind of machinery and could fix anything from wristwatches to complex mechanisms of software equipment and machine tools. "Lexi, thank you for everything," Eden said when dinner was over. "Amin is feeling much better." "Oh, come on," Lexi said. "I'm glad I could help. Believe me, any other doctor in my position would have done the same thing without hesitation." "I hope we'll meet again," Eden asked hopefully. "Sure," Lexi replied. Eden paid for dinner and walked Lexi home. The walk in the evening as a whole had been wonderful. In Lexi's opinion, it had been a long time since she'd had such a good time. Even during her romantic relationship with her ex-husband, she couldn't remember such emotions. And that was because Edward had been stingy with gifts or flowers, as well as with displays of affection. Eden, on the other hand, was different. He could recite poems by famous poets out loud, making his heart swoon with happiness and delight. And then Lexi told him about her inheritance. "The recycling plant?" Eden asked cautiously. She nodded in agreement. "Can I see the unfinished marvel, I hope?" he asked. "Of course you can, but be warned, it's the city dump. It smells," Lexi warned him. Sensing that Ammon's father was serious, Eden decided to go all the way. On his day off, he went to the realm of household waste and garbage. The sun was already slipping towards sunset when Eden and Lexi found themselves there, coloring the sky in. Begraming in purple tones. It cast long shadows from the trash that towered over the dump, like unfriendly, jagged mountains. Lexi walked ahead of Eden, whose work boots sank into the dust and fine debris with a thud. She stopped, pointing to an unfinished metal structure that looked more like the skeleton of a giant animal than an industrial facility. "That's the mill, Eden." Eden, accustomed to the orderly world of the factory, where machines stood in rows and parts were arranged in their places, was startled. There was chaos everywhere. The acrid smell of rot mixed with the scent of gasoline and something sweetly spicy. The steel structures were rusting, damaged by time and weather. Vincent's dream was to make something useful out of it. Lexi continued, seeing that Eden was literally mesmerized by the sight, to recycle the trash to get energy. But alas, he didn't have time. "Impressive," Eden muttered, trying to ignore the smell. "I didn't think it was possible." "What's the big deal?" Lexi grinned. "It's the whole town's problem. All this garbage. It's not just lying around. It's poisoning the land, the air, the water." "Yes, I've noticed how dirty our river has become." Eden nodded. "We used to swim and fish there when we were kids. Now you can't even go near it." Lexi stepped forward, stepping around a pile of old refrigerators. It was to solve these problems that the project had been conceived. It was also supposed to give jobs to the homeless people who were surviving here. "But can't we just drive all this stuff away?" Eden said, and looked around, trying to understand the scale of the problem. "Where to another area? What about there? Our landfill is just a drop in the ocean, and there's more and more garbage every day. So we need to recycle," Eden said, looking at the mountains of garbage and the dilapidated factory. "It's not a bad idea. Could it work?" "Yeah, I'm sure it would." Lexi smiled. Vincent had put a lot of work into this project. He had the blueprints and schematics. He even assembled some prototypes of special machines. Immediately, Eden perked up. "And where are they?" "In the hangar." Lexi pointed to a small structure. that had miraculously escaped destruction. Almost all the documentation is stored there. "So let's go there," Eden exclaimed, and hurried after Lexi. The hangar turned out to be a huge space, filled with all kinds of mechanisms and devices. Dust covered everything in a thick layer. But even through the dust, they could see the unusual structures made from improvised materials. He was a real craftsman. Lexi lovingly ran her hand over the rusty surface of the homemade press. Even from old parts, he could create something new. He was a businessman, though, and he wasn't poor. Eden walked between the various devices like a mesmerized man, scrutinizing them. A light of enthusiasm lit up in his eyes. Accustomed to working with machines, he saw in these artisanal products a hidden potential, an unusual approach to problem solving. "What about the documentation? Can we understand how it all works?" Eden asked hopefully. "The documentation is in the container." Lexi pointed to a metal structure. "I hope it's still intact." And the young men then rummaged through the container, finding yellowed blueprints, handwritten notes, diagrams, and calculations. "Interesting," Eden whispered. Leafing through a thick notebook filled with Vincent's handwriting, he was researching different types of garbage and developing recycling techniques. "Yes, he dreamed of making our city cleaner." "So we can do it," Eden said suddenly. Not taking his eyes off the notebook, we can get this plant up and running. "Are you serious?" Lexi was surprised. Eden smiled and nodded in agreement, saying it was time to head back. Subsequently, he started with the simplest of things. The first thing he did was check the electrical wiring, replacing some parts with more modern ones. Cleaned and repaired broken mechanisms. Lexi, in turn, helped him by studying the records and blueprints. "I think we can start with plastic recycling," Eden said, showing her a schematic of one of the devices. "This press can shred plastic, and then it can be processed into pellets." "What about the rest of the trash?" Lexi couldn't help herself. "Well, not all at once. You have to eat the elephant in pieces," Eden smiled. "First plastic, and then we'll work on other types of waste." Days went by, and Eden spent all his free time at the landfill. At first he was just a mechanic, but he quickly learned and developed into a real engineer. "I think we're going to need a helper soon, and maybe more than one," Eden said, sitting in the hangar behind the blueprints. "The press is too complex for you and me to handle alone." "You mean someone from the factory?" Lexi asked. "Maybe put out a call to students. Surely there are enthusiasts who are interested in the subject." "We could try," Lexi supported his idea. And they did. They placed an ad in the newspaper at the factory and in the hallway of the local university. But soon they found a few kids who wanted to join their project. Day after day, week after week, they turned the old dump into a place of new possibilities. They were making a new future out of dirty and polluted piles of trash. In doing so, Lexi continued to save people in the surgery department as before. And Eden, a factory mechanic, turned into an engineer who gave a second life to garbage. Edward, though he was no longer alive by this time, still continued to inspire his followers. Naturally, Edward and Janie, Dad and Mom, didn't know all of this and had little preparation for the retrial. But Lexi's lawyer, Bob, wasted no time and did a huge amount of work. As it turned out, on the day of the alleged accident, Edward fell down the stairs not by accident at all. So it was preceded by a violent quarrel with his adopted son. The lawyer was told all this by the former maid of the Smith family, who heard everything, but had to quit after the accident. In fact, Edward knew he was adopted and even found his real parents, who were drunk and living in a junkyard, and living on odd jobs. In a fit of rage and resentment toward his estranged father, Edward misjudged his strength and accidentally pushed Edward Sir down the stairs. Although the push came out relatively weak, Edward Sir was debilitated by the illness. That was enough. After realizing what had happened, Edward, with Janie's help, immediately came up with a fairy tale version of an accidental fall, deciding to indirectly blame Lexi for it. But he didn't think that Bob, who was a bit of a nuisance, would be able to get to the truth. So the retrial was fatal for Edward, and he found himself in the dock instead of the plaintiff. Isabel was blown away. Janie swore she knew nothing about the scam, but for Lexi, her ex-mother-in-law's words didn't matter. After all, together with Eden, they had fulfilled Edward Sturdot's dream, and the recycling plant was slowly gaining momentum. A man recovered. The only thing that reminded him of the incident was a small scar on his leg, which, in his father's opinion, had clearly added gray hairs. But the most important thing wasn't even that. It was the fact that, having defended her inheritance, Lexi was able to start a new life with Eden and her mother. They had a beautiful, modest wedding, and they were just happy. I'm pregnant by your husband. After learning of her husband and sister's betrayal, Jennifer left for the country. And barely. Jennifer was just leaving the clinic when she got a call from her younger sister. "Hi, what are you doing?" Her sister's voice vibrated with joy, which was very audible even over the phone. "I just got off work," Jennifer replied tiredly. "I'm getting off work. I'm going to drive home and sleep it off." "Listen, sister, Maggie said. It's the same thing every day. Aren't you tired of living such a boring life yourself?" Jennifer gritted her teeth to keep herself from saying something sarcastic to Maggie. No, she'd always been able to keep her temper in check with her younger sister. But lately, apparently because of the increased workload and the unstable family situation, Jennifer was beginning to feel her nerves fraying. "Aren't you tired of telling me the same thing every time?" she said. Jennifer got into the car and switched on the ignition. She wanted to go home, have a cup of tea, take a bath, and then crawl into bed with a blanket over her head. "Well, I'm sorry," Maggie said in a softer voice now. "No offense. I just wanted to ask you something." "I didn't even doubt it," Jennifer thought to herself with annoyance. Then she turned on the car's heater. It was the middle of October outside. By 7 p.m., it was very dark outside, and it was also very cold, which was not conducive to a better mood and the desire to do anything but relax. "Did you ask me not to drag this out?" Jennifer said. "More money?" Maggie clucked her tongue. "I haven't asked you for money in a long time." "What are you saying to me, Jen?" "No, I wanted to ask you for your suitcase. Can you lend it to me for about a week? Well, 10 days tops." "Are you going somewhere?" asked the older sister, more out of politeness than genuine interest. "Yes, I'm going to the sea." Maggie answered cheerfully. "Unlike you, my plans are not all about work and home. You're the one who has always lived a boring and proper life." Jennifer remained silent. Indeed, she had always tried to live right. But did it really look boring from the outside? Perhaps for a 23-year-old girl, life between home and work does seem gray and dull. But that was Jennifer's life before marriage. Maybe she really is living life the wrong way. Von Bridget is constantly traveling somewhere and manages to work, and her personal life is boiling. And Jennifer, right after graduation, got married, got a job at the clinic, and since then in her life almost nothing has happened. Early rise in the morning, then the road to work, then the reception of patients from morning to lunch, in the afternoon work with documents or visits to patients at home. Even on weekends, Jennifer managed to work in a private clinic. When she was on holiday, she either went on training courses or spent time at seminars and conferences. For her almost 30 years of life, she has never been to the sea, did not fly on a plane on holiday, did not buy herself a beautiful swimming costume. I guess her life really was boring and dull. Line. Maggie even giggled into the phone. "Can you hear me? I need a suitcase." "You're always going on holiday," Jennifer replied, distracted from her sad thoughts. "Don't you have a suitcase?" Can you believe it? Maggie kept talking into the phone, unable to get a word in edgewise. "On my last trip, my suitcase was dropped when I was reloading my luggage. It cracked, and I haven't been able to buy a new one since." You bet Jennifer thought to herself, sighing and listening to the complaining speech. You go to resorts several times a year. You don't even have time to buy a suitcase between trips. And then she regretted it and scolded herself for being too hard on her younger sister. After all, it wasn't Maggie's fault that Jennifer preferred work to leisure and could afford regular trips to the sea. "When can I come to your place to pick up my suitcase?" Maggie asked, again forcing Jennifer to switch her thoughts. "You can come whenever you want to come. Tomorrow," said her sister cheerfully. "I don't suppose you're in any condition to receive guests today?" "Yes, tomorrow afternoon would be better. Tomorrow's Saturday. I'll be seeing patients at the clinic until 3, so come after 3. "That's fine. Thank you." The nurse chirped something else into the phone, musing about how her trip was going so well. Autumn was setting in outside. She'd be going to some hot country, splashing in the warm sea, and she wouldn't have to freeze in the city until the heating came back on. Jennifer got home at about 8 o'clock. She entered the empty flat, found the light switch in the hallway by feel, and switched on the light. She sat down on the banquette by the entrance, stretched her legs out. She sighed heavily. How lonely it was on nights like this, when Winston was late at work and Jennifer had to return to the empty, dark flat. How many times she'd wanted a cat or a dog, but then she'd talked herself out of it because she realized that, because she and her husband were always busy at work, it would be hard for the poor creature to sit alone and cooped up for long hours. She took her phone out of her coat pocket. Jennifer dialed Winston's number. She didn't expect her husband to answer immediately, or that he would answer her call at all. Sure enough, the phone rang with long beeps, and her husband never answered. After preparing a quick dinner and taking a shower, Jennifer looked longingly at her mobile phone screen. Her husband never called back or even texted. Jennifer, trained by life experience, realized that it was useless to wait for a call from her eternally busy spouse. Winston, the head of the department at the regional hospital, was busy 24 hours a day. He could have an emergency operation, some urgent concilium that required his obligatory participation. There could have been a meeting. All in all, Jennifer had long since become accustomed to the fact that her husband was a very busy man. She didn't work and didn't voice her opinion on the matter. Already falling asleep in bed after a hot shower and dinner, Jennifer heard the phone ring. It was Winston calling. "I'm just leaving work." Jennifer jumped up sharply in bed and looked at the wall clock. It was past 11 o'clock in the evening. She hadn't noticed herself falling into slumber. "I'm waiting for you. Shall I heat up dinner?" Jennifer asked. "No need. I had a snack at work. We had a meeting. Everyone was hungry by then, so we decided we'd order pizza. Anyway, I've eaten so I don't have to bother reheating the food." Jennifer breathed a sigh of relief. By the time her husband arrived home, she had a headache. So after waiting for Winston, she immediately fell asleep, not really knowing what the head of the department was so late for. In the morning, when she awoke, she found her husband no longer at home. Hopelessness, longing came over Jennifer. She ate breakfast and stared out the window alone. Then she started to get ready for her part-time job at a private clinic. For more than 5 years, Jennifer had been working as a general practitioner at the city's polyclinic, while managing patients at private clinics. She enjoyed her work, especially when she saw the results of her labor and heard the words of gratitude from her patients. Everything was going well in her work. And even despite all the difficulties, Jennifer always came out of work satisfied with herself and the results of her work. As for her personal life, then everything was not as simple as we would like. Jennifer's husband, Winston Kudryashov, was older than his wife for 20 years, and for 15 years he had been the head of a department at the regional hospital. As a specialist, Winston enjoyed high prestige, had behind his back a huge professional experience, thousands of grateful patients, and a lot of awards. Jennifer felt like a girl next to him, and given the difference in age, experience in both professional and life, the young wife only had to listen to the opinion of her wise husband. "Why are you marrying such an old man?" Jennifer was asked by her mate, Maggie. "Is it a duty? Winston is almost 45, he's older than you, and he's older than you, and he's a doctor. So you'll be in constant competition. He's bound to always be better than you." "He is the best for me," Jennifer replied with a smile. "I love this man very much. You have no idea how strong my feelings for him are." She was 24 years old at the time. She was in her final year of medical school, and Winston, in her eyes, was a medical guru. Jennifer even then looked into the mouth of her future husband, listened to his advice, listened to stories from practice, and believed that fate has made her a real gift in the form of meeting and mutual sympathy, with such an intelligent, beautiful, and very responsive man. They met when Jennifer was 20 years old. Winston had already turned 40. She was in her third year of university, and he was consulting teachers at the university and lectured for a while on obstetrics and gynecology. Jennifer met Winston in the library. He was just dictating to one of the students a list of literature required for the course. Jennifer went there to prepare for the seminar. "Young lady, you're wasting your time in this library," Winston addressed her when she asked the librarian to look for an ophthalmology textbook for her. "Why wasted?" Jennifer looked up in surprise at the man she had often met in the walls of her university. Winston did not lecture at them, but the girl had seen his picture in the hall and knew exactly who he was. "Because the university's library is sparse on teaching materials. In terms of terminology, I advise you to buy your textbooks from a bookstore. Or better yet, order them online," Winston replied. "That's a strange suggestion from you," Jennifer grinned. "Usually our library gets all the praise, and you say the exact opposite." "I just always tell the truth," Winston said. Winston grinned, then winked at the librarian. "And don't look at me like that, Rachel. Am I wrong? Your library's been short on manuals for a long time," he said. "You're right, Winston," she sighed. Jennifer took a couple of textbooks. As she left the library, she ran into Winston again. "Will you take my advice?" he asked. Jennifer looked at Winston in surprise. "What kind of advice? Go to the shop or order online?" "Well, going to the shop and choosing the textbook you want would be faster. While you're waiting for the online order, it might not be relevant to you." Jennifer shrugged her shoulders. "Well, I'll go to the bookshop then. Can I give you a lift?" Jennifer was taken aback. She had never once spoken to this man. She hadn't even paid attention to him, thinking he was too experienced and not interested in talking to young female students. Winston's question, however, confused her. She looked at him incredulously, then nodded suddenly. "Okay, bring me in." From that day on, communication began between them. At first it was just idle chatter, not so much about medicine, but about the lives of students and faculty, Jennifer's childhood and Winston's adolescence. It turned out that the man had been married once. "My ex-wife herself filed for divorce because of eternal employment, and I did not keep around a woman who was far from medicine and considered my work frivolous," said Winston. "She was not ready to wait for me in the evenings and wanted me to socialize with other women, jealous of them and of my work too. But as a gynecologist, how could I restrict myself from socializing with the female sex? It's my job, my duty, my life after all. And then I realized that I could only live with a woman who, like me, has something to do with medicine, who would be sympathetic to my late returns and would not make hysterics and scandals about it." "Is that so much to ask, Jennifer?" Winston asked. Jennifer shook her head at the sound of her name in Winston's mouth. Goosebumps ran down her spine. She looked at the man differently now. In him, Jennifer saw a kindred spirit, someone close to her in spirit. Even more so. The thought that she could become a doctor and even his wife in the future made her sweetly dizzy. In the meantime, their relationship had moved to a new level, and now Jennifer often stayed overnight in Winston's flat. She felt relaxed and confident around this man. She knew that Winston was old enough and experienced enough. He would not hurt her, always support her, and also help her with her studies and explain simple truths. In general, the girl was happy, but to the last did not believe that Winston could make her a proposal. Arriving home to her parents in a small provincial town 250 kilometers from the regional center where she studied, Jennifer immediately told the truth about her relationship with a man who was almost twice her age. "Are you crazy?" Her mother rounded her eyes and clutched her head. "You are 23 years old and he is 43. 20 years is almost a lifetime. 2 decades. Jennifer's father wasn't thrilled with his daughter's choice, but he was sympathetic to her feelings. "Sharon, why do you resent it so much? There are a million families in the world, and they're strong enough, where the husband is older than his wife. It would be worse if it were the other way round. And Jennifer would be the guy who fell in love with an old aunt," he said. "Dad, Winston is not old," Jennifer interceded for her lover. "He's mature, he's wise, he's very experienced." "What kind of doctor is he? asked her mother. "I'm glad your Winston is a good doctor," she said, her lips tightening. "But it would be good if he was your age, not 20 years older. Edith, this is a disaster." Edward only hummed, without saying anything else. After a while, Jennifer dared to invite Winston to her parents' house for a visit. They came along with a cake and a bouquet of flowers. And then Marion melted, seeing before her a manly and intelligent man. Edic also did not say another word about what he thought about the choice of his daughter. Then Jennifer finally realized that Winston was the man with whom she would be truly happy. Maggie, however, when she saw what a grown-up groom her older sister had brought into the house, did not keep silent. "He's an old man," wrinkled nose said 17-year-old Maggie when she and her sister were alone. "What do you need it for?" Jennifer wanted to take offense at her sister's words, but then she managed to resist the urge and smiled softly. "You're not the one who has to live with him. What am I, you crying about him being old for me?" Maggie twitched her nose upwards and wrinkled it funny again. "Well, he's going to be a relative of mine. You look at him like you want to eat him. I'm sure you're already dreaming of marriage and a long life with that old man." "Don't call him that," Jennifer said, feeling herself getting angry with her younger sister. "He's not an old man. He's only 20 years older than I am. When you choose a fiancé, you can choose your own, but don't meddle in my affairs." "Your choice." Maggie shrugged her shoulders. "But sooner or later you'll regret marrying such an old man." Her younger sister's words were not prophetic. And not once in almost 6 years of married life Jennifer did not regret that she agreed to become Winston's wife. He proposed to her in her 5th year. Then Jennifer moved into his spacious 2-bedroom flat. Soon received a diploma, got a job in the clinic, and was going to enter the residency. When her parents came to visit their daughter for the first time after the wedding, they no longer opposed Jennifer's choice, but on the contrary, they were happy that the girl so successfully married and settled in the regional center. First impressions are deceiving, Marion grinned, strolling through the huge 3-bedroom apartment in the center of town. Winston turned out to be a very nice man. He paid for the wedding and brought you to his place. Hang on to him, daughter. He's a good man. "I know," Jennifer said with a smile. She was in love, happy and ready to move mountains. Being a doctor was a pleasure. Jennifer was sure that she had found a job she liked, and the results of her work pleased her. And each time convinced Jennifer that she had done the right thing. The only thing that confused the young wife of the famous gynecologist was that Winston constantly discouraged her from entering the residency. "Don't you like being a general practitioner?" he asked. "You're all glowing. You're happy to be working. So why go to school and waste your time doing it?" Jennifer didn't argue with her husband because she wasn't used to it. Winston's word was always paramount to her. So after a few months of thinking about her future, Jennifer decided that she would stay on as a general practitioner in a regular clinic. Her friends who had gone to university with her only shrugged their shoulders as they listened to Jennifer's explanations for her refusal to continue her studies. "Don't you think your Winston is just afraid of competition?" One of her former classmates once asked Jennifer. "You'll become a subspecialist and overshadow him with your practice." "You what?" Jennifer only laughed as she listened to her friend's words. "Winston is too experienced and wise enough to be afraid of competition. Besides, he's a gynecologist, which is not my field of expertise." "Are you always defending him?" Grinned her mate. "You're used to the fact that he controls you in everything. He makes you dance to his tune. Personally, I'd be offended if my husband behaved like that." "That's why Winston's my husband, not yours," Jennifer tried to make a joke, but she was suddenly uncomfortable. What if there was truth in her friend's words? What if Winston was afraid that his wife might be better than him? Jennifer carefully avoided these thoughts. She didn't want to think badly of her husband. She loved him too much. 2 years after the marriage was registered, Jennifer thought about having a child. She was already 26. Her husband was an excellent gynecologist and she had no fears about motherhood. "Winston," she said, trying not to make the words sound like a decision she'd made alone. "Do you want children?" Winston looked at his wife somewhat distantly, as if Jennifer had started a conversation off topic. "Honey, why are you asking me that? You're 26 years old. It's too young to be thinking about this." "It is." Jennifer was annoyed by Winston's words. I'm 26 years old, which is the right age to have a baby. You don't have children from your first marriage. Maybe it's time to become a father." There was so much hope and anticipation in Jennifer's voice that she could barely contain her emotions. As for Winston, it was as if he had no desire to become a father. "It's too early. Do your work. You need to make a name for yourself to be able to advance in the future." "But how am I going to get ahead if I'm just going to sit in a regular GP's office? You're the one who talked me out of going to school, and now you're talking me out of having a baby." Jennifer didn't notice that she had spoken with resentment in her voice, and she stopped when she saw her husband's stern look. "It's not time yet," Jennifer Winston said. And that was the end of the matter. Jennifer, unused to arguing with her husband because of his unwavering authority and age, had given herself her word that she would not bring up any more talk that displeased Winston. But Marian was not afraid to ask her eldest daughter such questions. "Do you and Winston think about children at all?" The question was painful, and Jennifer even wrinkled her nose at the unpleasant feeling inside. She and Winston had never revisited the topic of future parenthood, and what to answer her mother, Jennifer did not know. She was used to telling everyone the truth: her husband, her family, her colleagues, and her patients. But now that the question touched on such a painful subject, Jennifer didn't know how she could gently skirt the sharp edges. "It's too early for us. I'm working. Winston's working." "There's plenty of time," she said. I wouldn't say that Marian objected, looking closely at her daughter's face. "You'll be 30 soon. And you say it's early. I gave birth to you when I was 23. And that wasn't considered too early to give birth. It's harder to have a baby after 30. There's more pain and less time. What am I explaining to you? You're a doctor yourself." Jennifer was ashamed to admit to her mother that her husband didn't want children and thought it was too early for them to become parents. Winston was about to turn 50. That was a decent enough age for a man, especially one who had no children yet. Jennifer honestly didn't understand why her husband was so resistant to the idea of children, not interested in her women's health or trying to strengthen their family. It was getting harder and harder to return home. No one was waiting for Jennifer there. She longed for a husband who was always late at work. She even began to understand the first wife of Winston, who complained about the constant absences of her husband from home and filed for divorce because of his eternal employment. But when Jennifer remembered Winston's words about how much he wanted to meet someone who would understand him and not complain about his passion for work, she immediately tried to ward off the thought of resenting her husband for his devotion to his favorite work. Having calmed down a little mentally, Jennifer decided that she didn't want to get herself worked up anymore, that she had chosen the fate of being the wife of the head of one of the departments of a regional hospital. So it was not worth complaining about her plight or berating Winston for her constant absence from home and being in the hospital. After her appointment at the private clinic, she dialed her husband's number. "Where are you?" "Still in the hospital." Jennifer asked the questions automatically, subconsciously guessing what Winston would answer her. "I'm at home, cooking dinner," her husband answered, and Jennifer's heart jumped joyfully in her chest. She'd been telling herself that Winston didn't want to be home with her, that he was looking for any excuse to stay late at work, and that he'd neglected his chores. "You surprised me," Jennifer said with undisguised joy. "What are you cooking?" "You'll find out when you get home," Winston laughed. "Maybe I want to surprise you? It won't be a surprise." Jennifer thought with awe of how wonderful her husband was. She was lucky, after all. And even though they were so rarely together, he was and still was the best man on the planet. As she entered the flat, she heard Winston's voice and someone else's female laughter. It wasn't until a moment later that Jennifer realized exactly where she had heard that laughter. It was her younger sister, Maggie, laughing. Jennifer remembered that Maggie was supposed to pick up her suitcase, but her sister usually called or texted her. She'd arrived without a call or a text. "Oh, sister." "Hello." Maggie waved to Jennifer without rising from her chair in the kitchen. "I thought I'd never see you again. Why didn't you call me?" Jennifer didn't like the fact that Maggie showed up at her house unannounced. "Why?" Maggie wondered. But the smile flickered off her lips. "You told me to come round after 3. I did. We never said we'd call or text." Jennifer didn't know why she resented her little sister's arrival so much. Maggie didn't seem to have done anything wrong. She had arrived on time, and they hadn't really agreed to call in advance. But for some reason, her sister's smile, her happy face, and her contented look caused Jennifer to feel a rush of negativity. "What's wrong with me?" Jennifer asked herself that question, but she had no answer. Maggie hadn't annoyed her this much before, even though she didn't always watch her words and sometimes offended Jennifer. Maggie was the exact opposite of her older sister. Daring, self-assured, self-loving, and not tolerating objections, and Jennifer was malleable, kind, and non-confrontational. It was easier for her to agree than to argue to the point of frothing at the mouth. Maggie liked to argue, refute, prove her point of view, even if it was obvious that it was wrong. Winston set the table. By the time his wife returned from work, he had prepared fish and salad. Jennifer looked at the utensils Winston was setting on the table, but she couldn't remember the last time her husband had cooked anything himself. It had happened, but only at the beginning of the relationship, when Jennifer was still living in his flat as his wife-to-be. As soon as they legalized their relationship, all the duties of cooking, cleaning, laundry, and other household chores were fully transferred to the newly married wife of Winston. "Are you guys going on holiday?" Maggie asked in a cheerful voice. Jennifer heard a kind of gloating in her sister's question. Maggie regularly went on holiday with different men and in different countries, often allowed herself to go abroad alone. Jennifer, on the other hand, had never been to another country in her nearly 30 years of life. "We don't have time for holidays," she said, trying to keep her voice calm and confident. "We are working. You're the free-flying one." "That's right," Maggie smiled broadly. "I know how to take everything in life, and you all work and work until you retire. Is that how you're going to live?" Jennifer glanced at her husband sitting next to her. Winston was eating his fish with a nonchalant face, as if he wasn't even listening to what the women were saying at the table. "We're not." Jennifer rose abruptly from the table. "Have you eaten? Go get your suitcase." Maggie's face changed instantly. The smile fell from her lips, her eyebrows furrowed. The younger sister clearly hadn't expected such blatant inhospitality from her older sister. "Jennifer, what are you doing?" She pouted. "I'm not bragging or making fun of your lifestyle. Well, you like to work. I don't mind." "Of course you do," Jennifer snorted. "Get your bags. Go and get ready for your next holiday. I'm very tired. Tomorrow is my only day off, and I really want to rest at least that day." Maggie was clearly offended. She thanked Winston dryly for lunch, then took her suitcase and, after a brief goodbye to Jennifer, left the house. Winston was silent the whole time and expressed no emotion. Suddenly he asked, "What are you doing? What, did she do something bad to you?" "What makes you think that?" "It's just that she takes up a lot of my time, effort, and energy. I'm tired, Winston. I wanted to spend this weekend with you, and here's Maggie and her stories about her trouble-free life." Winston grinned. "Are you jealous or something?" Jennifer felt a chill run down her spine. Her husband, who had always been characterized by his independence of opinion and lack of any emotion towards outsiders, had suddenly asked a rather strange question. A question that made Jennifer suddenly feel ashamed. Really, is it envy? Maggie was usually jealous of her older sister because she had things Maggie didn't have, opportunities Maggie didn't have due to her age. Guys who liked her older sister better than her younger sister. Jennifer was always one step ahead. And by the time she was 30, it suddenly slowed down and Maggie began to pull ahead in the quality of her life. She wasn't burdened with work, liked men, handled them skillfully, getting everything she needed and more. Jennifer seemed to be mired in her gray and boring life, with nothing but work and love for her husband. Her mood had completely soured after her sister left. And even though Winston stayed at home and was not going anywhere for work, Jennifer constantly replayed in her head her dialogue with Maggie. And why did her older sister have so much negativity inside her towards her younger sister? They had been communicating less and less lately. It had been fine at first. As soon as Maggie moved to New York, she was constantly asking to borrow money or to sleep over at Jennifer and Winston's flat. In the last 2 years, Maggie had become quite independent of both her parents and her older sister. "I completely forgot to tell you," Winston distracted his wife from sad thoughts. On Tuesday, I'm leaving for a scientific and practical congress on obstetrics and gynecology. It turns out that I was scheduled to attend the congress, but I got so busy that I forgot about it. That's strange. Jennifer looked at her husband in surprise. Usually you prepare for congresses in advance. Suddenly you seem to have changed your attitude to such events. Winston brushed it off. Work's a mess. People are quitting in droves and going to private clinics. I've lost track of time. HR called me last night and reminded me about the trip. Where are you going? Jennifer suddenly had a brilliant idea in her voice. What if she went to the Congress with her husband, took a few days off at work, spent time with Winston, and generally changed the environment? The idea was reckless, unusual for Jennifer. But she, annoyed by the meeting and conversation with her younger sister, suddenly also wanted to change something in her life. To Boston, Winston said. For 5 days. Jennifer smiled. What if I come with you, take a leave of absence at my own expense, and we'll go to Boston together? I'll walk around the city waiting for you. We'll go to restaurants, visit a museum, go to the theater. Do you remember the last time we went out together? Winston shook his head. The Congress will go on from morning until late at night, and I won't have time to go to the theaters and restaurants, Winston said. You're going to be upset, and you're going to tug at me and keep asking me when I'm coming to see you. I'll piss you off with my absence, and our mini holiday will be a nightmare. I've been through this before, honey, and I don't want it again. Jennifer looked at her husband as if he were directly discouraging her from traveling together. Not once in the 6 years they had been together had she said a word of reproach to him. Not once had she held him or made a scandal of his prolonged absences. Why now Winston spoke as if he did not know his wife at all, as if she in his eyes had turned into his ex-wife, whom he tried with all his might to forget. Winston, don't you want me to come with you? Jennifer asked uncertainly, still hoping she was imagining it. I do, Winston said hotly. He jumped up from the couch where he'd been sitting watching TV, running around the living room with his arms crossed behind his back. Jennifer watched her husband as if she didn't recognize him as the man she had loved for so many years. But I also want to work in peace, without the distraction of worrying about you sitting in a foreign city waiting for me. I want to meet my colleagues, chat with my professors. I want to get some sleep, after all. Okay, Jennifer interrupted Winston and nodded briefly. Please, just don't be so nervous. Let it be as you say. Winston abruptly stopped talking, sat down on the sofa and continued watching some medical TV program. Jennifer sat next to him and occasionally glanced at her husband, but it was as if he didn't see her. They used to sit and watch TV together like this, but now they had become complete strangers to each other. No children together, no jointly acquired property, no desire to go out and spend time together. Maybe this is the end of our marriage? Jennifer thought bitterly. He does not even want to hug me, kiss me. And we haven't had intimacy in almost a month. My husband hasn't laid a finger on me in a month, and that thought made me feel even more miserable. It seemed as if the whole world called family, so lovingly maintained for 6 years, had collapsed. Winston left on Tuesday, and up to that point nothing at all had changed in their relationship with Jennifer. The spouse no longer initiated intimacy. Jennifer kept looking at Winston, trying to figure out if he'd really lost interest in her, or if she was just imagining the problem. There's no need to see me off, her husband said at once. I'll go straight from the hospital to the airport. 5 days will fly by, and I'll be sure to bring you a present from Boston. Would you like that, honey? Of course I do, Jennifer said, and smiled a strained smile. The mood had been bad for a long time, and the situation with her husband's departure had spoilt it even more. Now Winston had asked her not to walk him to the airport, even though Jennifer couldn't do that. She worked until 3, and Winston's plane was due to leave at 5. Returning to the empty flat became a complete drag for Jennifer. She tried to stay late at work, pretending to work on paperwork and reports while she tried to stretch her time so she could get home as late as possible. The clinic closed at 8 p.m., and by that time Jennifer had to go home anyway, having vacated her office. To distract herself and not go crazy with boredom, Jennifer even signed up for yoga. She decided that she would attend a yoga studio in the evenings instead of coming home. It was both good for her health and a way to pass the time. When Jennifer returned from her first class on Thursday, she felt much better. She seemed to be energized after the workout. Her muscles were humming nicely and her body felt pleasantly tired. She wanted to go to bed as soon as possible, so that the day would be over. The sooner it was over, the sooner the new one would come. It wouldn't be long before Winston returned. Lying in bed under a blanket and looking at her social networking page, Jennifer saw Maggie's holiday photos. Her younger sister posed against the sea, standing in a brightly colored swimming costume. Jennifer quickly woke up looking at the pictures, trying not to dwell on the unpleasant thoughts that had arisen in her head. Enviously again, she thought, and quickly refreshed her social media page so that the pictures of her beautiful and happy little sister would disappear from her sight as soon as possible. However, updating the page, Jennifer suddenly noticed something unpleasantly cutting her eyes on one of the photos published by Maggie. Returning to her sister's page, Jennifer scrutinized Maggie's postings once more and then zoomed in on one of the photos. Her heart twitched unpleasantly in her chest. Her palms instantly sweated with excitement. In one of Maggie's photos, Jennifer saw a familiar figure in the reflection of a shop window. It was the figure of her husband, who had personally taken the photograph for the young girl. Jennifer enlarged the photo once more to make sure again that it was Winston. She recognized his figure, his hair, even his sunglasses. He was also wearing the plaid shirt Maggie had given him for the holiday. Back then, Jennifer had wanted to give that shirt to her father, but Winston had persuaded her to keep the gift. Maggie gave the shirt to me. Why should I give it to your dad? Winston asked unhappily. Because it doesn't suit you, Jennifer replied. Jennifer didn't know why she was suddenly so attracted to Maggie's gift. Maybe it was because the shirt fit Winston so well. Jennifer herself had never guessed his taste. Her husband always dressed himself in the shops. He picked out his own shirts, trousers, jeans. He even bought his own underwear. And then some Maggie gave him a nice gift that Winston liked. Jennifer was nervous at the time. She was uncomfortable that her husband openly admired Maggie's taste, but he had a very different opinion of his own wife's taste. Until the last moment, Jennifer didn't want to believe that Winston was in the photograph. Then suddenly she remembered how her husband didn't want her to go to Boston with him, how he refused to let his wife accompany him to the airport. And that dinner he'd cooked, supposedly for his wife, had probably been prepared solely in honor of Maggie's arrival. Jennifer grabbed the phone in her hands and dialed Winston's number. The caller is temporarily unavailable, an automated female voice answered. If Winston was in the United States, he would be in touch, but Jennifer's husband was in Greece, of that she had no doubt. Then she dialed the number of his colleague Kevin, who was filling in for Winston during periods of his absence. Never before had Jennifer called Kevin on her own just for fun. If Winston found out about his wife's all behavior now, he would clearly be displeased. Jennifer, hello. Kevin's voice sounded soft and good-natured. What happened to Winston? I can't get him on the phone. Is there a problem with his connection in Boston? Jennifer clutched the phone tightly in her hand, feeling her fingers ache with tension. Boston? Kevin's voice sounded surprised now. Had he gone to Boston? As far as I know, your husband went to stay with his parents in Chicago. He told me his father was sick, so he took a week off at his own expense. Winston visits his father a lot. I mean, he lives alone, he gets sick a lot. Or, Jennifer, am I confused? Jennifer was silent, ready to cry. She knew very well that Winston does not communicate with his father. John Smith had lived in Philadelphia for many years, where he had gone with his new family while Winston was still at university. This story was told to Jennifer by Winston himself, but he apparently had a different version for his colleagues. I'm sorry, Kevin, I'm on the phone with Winston, she said. I got it wrong. I must have been working too hard. She switched off the connection, then tossed the phone aside with a squeamishness. Of course, no Winston had called her. She'd made up the story for Kevin, who could easily guess that Winston was misleading both his wife and his colleagues. So all her husband's trips to congresses, conferences, and other business trips were staged exclusively for her. For his colleagues, Dr. Smith went to his father, while his wife was quietly waiting for him at home, even unaware of the double life her husband led. After a while, Jennifer's hand reached for the phone. Fighting her own reluctance to know the truth, she went back to her sister Bridget's page. Here was her trip to Hawaii in April. Winston had flown to Los Angeles for a fortnight, and Jennifer had been surprised to see how tanned her husband had been when he returned from Los Angeles. And it turns out that in April in Los Angeles is so sunny. I walked a lot. I did not notice how I burned, said Winston then. Jennifer didn't say anything to him. It did not even occur to her that her husband could be somewhere else, for example, in a hot country with her younger sister. And here was another of Maggie's trips, this time to the Bahamas. Winston was away from home then, too. He was supposedly on a flight to Denver. Except it was summer outside, and it was normal for him to return with a slight tan. There were other trips. Jennifer had counted at least 5 in the last 40 minutes. It had started almost 2 years ago. At least the joint disappearances from Jennifer's life had been observed since the December before last. And Ben had just turned 21 at the time. She'd barely graduated from university and got a job as a receptionist at a beauty parlor. But she worked there for just under 6 months. She quit in December, and then in March she and Winston were out of town together. Bridget chattered something about a new lover, after which there was another, then again another and another third. But Jennifer was not interested in her younger sister's private life, and for nothing. I wonder if she met only with Winston or in parallel? Jennifer thought. Did she have other men? She was still in shock at her own discovery. To have lived with her husband for so many years, and now to suddenly find out that for the past 2 years he had been lying to her, dating her sister, traveling the world with her, paying for her purchases, catering to her every desire. His wife had done his laundry, cooked his breakfasts, lunches, and dinners, and waited faithfully for him at home. Without a word or a hint, she never let him know she was unhappy with anything. Jennifer was comfortable. People like her were usually called patient. By morning, she was sick of her own thoughts. All night she had been thinking that she had to make some decision about her future, because she would never have a future with Winston. I wonder, Jennifer thought, what was the purpose of this marriage show? He would have divorced me and lived with Maggie, if he liked being with her so much. He'd long since grown cold to me. Winston came home as promised on Sunday, happy and lightly tanned. He called Jennifer a couple of times via Messenger, sending her some meaningless pictures to put her guard down. She'd responded to him with something to keep Winston from guessing that she knew all about his cheating perfectly well. Jennifer prepared herself for the conversation, going to clear the air. She had to gather her strength to find the right words that would not make her feel ashamed. No, she wouldn't make hysterics and scandals. They would part ways quietly if Winston wanted them to. What do I want? Jennifer thought. I want to endure further. I am willing to endure because I love this man and would do anything to be with him. I haven't existed apart from Winston for a long time. I belong to him completely, unlike his soulmate that would die if I was separated from him. Winston talked cheerfully about his trip, making up stories as he went along that didn't really happen. Jennifer listened to him, smiling and nodding, while she realized with every passing minute that she couldn't tell Winston that she knew everything. She couldn't live without him. She never got round to talking to him, and after a few days she calmed down and decided that she would not part with her husband. She loved him and let him have an affair on the side. It was easy to break up a marriage, but to keep it together was still a challenge. So Jennifer decided she would endure to the end. At the end of another working day, when she was about to go home, there was a knock at her office. "The reception is over," Jennifer shouted, but the door opened anyway. Maggie stood on the doorstep, and the older sister's insides snapped at the sight of her younger sister. "Why are you here?" Jennifer asked with whitened lips. "We need to have a serious talk," Maggie replied. Jennifer realized then that something had happened. Something had happened that was out of her control. Something she had miscalculated. What it was, she was going to have to find out from her younger sister. "I'm pregnant," Maggie said after a long silence. The sisters sat next to each other, carefully avoiding the opportunity to look into each other's eyes, and remained silent until Maggie said 2 words that turned Jennifer's mind completely upside down. "Do I have to answer something?" Barely moving her lips, Jennifer asked. Jennifer's insides felt as if they had collapsed, and her lips and tongue stopped obeying her. "Shouldn't I?" Maggie replied shortly. "I'm the one who has to tell you. I'm pregnant by Winston, your husband. I'm tired of hiding the fact that I've been with him for a long time." Jennifer was silent. She fumbled with a piece of paper that had appeared on her desk. She couldn't say anything. It was like her tongue was stuck to her mouth. "Can you hear me?" Maggie asked demandingly. "I'm expecting your husband's child. I've been sleeping with him for a long time. A fortnight ago, he and I were on holiday in Miami, and before that we had sex at your house. Remember that spontaneous dinner at your place? You came over and told me to get my suitcase and you were leaving. I did. Only before that, I slept with your husband in your marital bed." The words were harsh, and Jennifer felt completely embarrassed by the filth. She didn't feel like it. She had tried to save her marriage to the last. Except who wanted it? Nobody. The child needed a father. No matter how immoral the child had been conceived, he was not to blame for his mother's recklessness, for his father's uncontrolled behavior. "What do you want from me?" Jennifer asked dryly. "For me to congratulate you? That I run home and scandalize my husband? That I look at myself in the mirror and try to see horns on my head?" Jennifer was about to scream, but Maggie, sitting across from her, kept her composure. Yes, that young woman had a lot of composure. She'd been scolded so many times by her parents, her grandmother, her teachers. Maggie didn't care about any of that. She had a way of keeping her cool, and that made Jennifer even more annoyed. "I want you to know the truth," Maggie said and stood up. "What you're going to do next, I don't know." "But I do," Jennifer said through gritted teeth. She left, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume. Jennifer thought about it and breathed in the air, realizing that she had often smelled it on her husband's shirts, the same shirts that her younger sister Maggie must have helped him buy. Everything in her family wasn't real her husband's love, the family idol, the way they lived together. So there was no happiness in the Winston household. Then why did they waste their time on each other? Returning home after work, Jennifer caught Winston there. Quickly gathering the necessary clothes into her suitcase, she put her books, laptop, and tablet in there as well. Then she closed it and sat down next to it on the bed. Covering her eyes, she tried to listen to herself and her sensations. What did she feel? Fear, resentment, hurt, disappointment. The last was perhaps the most vivid feeling. It was disappointment that Jennifer felt at losing her fake family. It was only an imitation of happiness, so it was necessary to leave without regret. Taking a piece of paper, Jennifer wrote a short note to Winston in the quick handwriting she had become accustomed to during her years at the clinic. "I know all about you and Maggie. I see no point in staying in this house. I will divorce you myself. We have nothing to share. Let's part amicably." There were no other words that came to mind. Jennifer did not write a long speech, but simply picked up her suitcase and left the flat. She took one last look at the wedding photograph hanging on the living room wall, where she and Winston were smiling broadly and happily, and got into the car. Their happiness was still real then. Jennifer calmly drove out of the city, refueled, and drove down the motorway. There were more than 300 kilometers to go. Staring into the darkness, she tried to remain calm and composed. Around 5 a.m., she was near a village with no streetlights, but a crumbling sign at the entrance and something that looked like a monument to chicken pox. Pulling over, Jennifer got out of the car, breathed in the fresh country air, and finally let the tears flow. For the 5 hours that Jennifer had been on the road, she had managed to remain calm and confident. But the village had turned her inside out. Standing in the darkness and the rain that had begun to fall, she felt endlessly tired and homesick. "Pull yourself together," she commanded herself, and then settled back behind the wheel and drove towards home. The house Jennifer stopped the car at had once belonged to her grandmother Julia, the mother of her father and Aunt Maggie. All her life, her grandmother had lived in this village 50 kilometers from her hometown. Several times she visited her son and his family, but she herself did not go anywhere further than the village. While Julia was still alive, she signed over her house to her eldest granddaughter, Jennifer. Maggie, learning of this then, took great offense at her sister. "You always get the best of everything," she cried with tears in her voice, "and the best room and clothes. Now grandmother's house too." "My God, Maggie, don't scream." Marian then cringed at her youngest daughter's loud, hysterical scream. "It's a house in the middle of nowhere." What do you want it for? No one has bought anything in this village for a long time, so you wouldn't get any benefit even if your grandmother wrote the house in your name. What's that got to do with it? Maggie smeared tears down her face. How am I any worse than Jennifer? Why does she get everything all the time and I get everything on my own? Jennifer remained silent at the time. She remembered how many times during her grandmother's lifetime she had visited her in the village, monitored her health, went with her to the city clinic, prescribed medicines. Maggie had never once visited her grandmother in her entire adult life. Once in a while she called her, and that only to borrow money, which in the end did not return. But after the death of her grandmother, who left the house to the eldest granddaughter, Maggie took offense, as usual, accused her older sister that she gets everything for nothing, for the pretty eyes. Maggie didn't speak to Jennifer for a long time after that. The house, left after the death of Julia's grandmother, was small, rather dilapidated, but inside it was very cozy and warm. Jennifer, every time she came to the village to visit her grandmother's grave, stopped in the house with joy and awe, looking at the old crockery, photographs, paintings on the wall, small statuettes on the chest of drawers. And everything in the house was the same as it had been when Grandma Julia was still alive. As children, when Jennifer was 12 and Maggie was 6, they had come together to visit her grandmother for the summer. That summer seemed to Jennifer the happiest of her life, but Maggie didn't like it in the village. I hate goat's milk, and I don't like cow's milk, it's fatty. And I don't want to eat pancakes. My grandmother can't bake them. And I won't eat the chicken that has been running around since morning, I feel sorry for it. And I will not go to the vegetable garden, my nose will burn. And then there will be a trace. Whatever Grandma Jennifer offered, Maggie refused. She did not like country life. The girl thought it was boring and monotonous, but Jennifer enjoyed spending time with her grandmother. Most of all, she liked to go with her grandmother Julia to the collective farm, where she worked as a veterinarian. Perhaps it was from these trips that Jennifer's love of medicine was born. You have the makings of a future doctor, Julia said. Think about your future. You may want to connect it with medicine. Jennifer had made up her mind then. She would definitely be a doctor, she would help people. That was her calling, and she was happy with her choice, immensely grateful to her grandmother for her support. And now Jennifer was back at her grandmother's house. Only this time she came not for a while, but for permanent residence. There was nowhere else to go. To stay in the house where Winston was, there was neither strength, nor desire, nor possibility. Jennifer could not claim her husband's flat. It was his personal property. And she had no place of her own, for until a few weeks ago the young woman had had the assurance that she would be with her husband until she was old. But no, not all wishes were destined to come true, and Jennifer had experienced this firsthand. Collapsing onto the bed, she buried her face into the pillow. The bedclothes smelled damp, and the house itself, unheated and uninhabited for several years, didn't look much like a cozy nest. Jennifer had a lot of work to do to put the house in order, quit her old job, get a job in the village, file for divorce. But most importantly, learning to live a new life in which Winston would no longer be there. Remembering him, Jennifer picked up the phone. 15 missed calls from her husband, 2 missed calls from her mother, and 1 from her father. Maggie hadn't called her, and Jennifer bitterly imagined how happy she and Winston were to be together. Calling her mother, Jennifer told it like it was. I've left Winston. I'm going to live in the country. Ow, but why? You have such an amazing husband. How did you have the courage to leave him? And more importantly, why? Ask your youngest daughter, Jennifer replied, feeling a surge of anger again. No, it was urgent to pull herself together, to push away the anger, jealousy, and resentment. There should be nothing in her life that connected her to the past. What has Maggie to do with it? Marion didn't hide her surprise. Maggie is expecting my husband's child. In fact, she's been seeing him for a long time. Mom, let's close this topic. I'll buy a new SIM card tomorrow and this number won't be available. I'm filing for divorce, changing my life and my job. Marion was still shouting something into the phone, but Jennifer wasn't listening to her anymore. Jennifer was terribly sleepy. It was already late at night. She didn't want to think about anything. She fell into sleep. At her grandmother's house, Jennifer thought longingly of the next day, which would now be radically different from the days she was used to. In the morning, she woke up with her nose tangled in the blanket. The house was cold, and it appeared that the first snow had fallen outside the window. Jennifer was glad that she had managed to cover the 300 kilometers on a dry road. But she would hardly have dared such a rash act if there had been ice on the motorway. She had to do something about the stove. She also had to buy groceries and call her former job. Having somehow explained the situation, Jennifer listened to a lot of complaints from the head doctor, but managed to agree to send her resignation letter by registered mail. "You've really let us down," shouted into the phone head doctor. And Jennifer understood it well without him. Leaving the polyclinic without a therapist in the midst of flu and acute respiratory viral infections was unfair, ill-considered, and selfish, in the doctor's opinion. Jennifer did not initiate him into the details of her personal life, saying that she went to another city for family reasons. Having resolved the job issue, she dressed warmly and went to the post office. "Oh my God," Jennifer, the operator, addressed her, holding out an envelope and a blank sheet on which Jennifer was to write her resignation letter. "Yes, that's me," Jennifer smiled weakly, remembering how she and her grandmother Julia had once gone to this woman's house to watch little newborn piglets. Postal Service operator Rachel lived 2 houses down from the late Julia. "Why are you here?" "I'm here to visit my grandmother's grave." "And why would you write a letter?" Jennifer sighed. Now she would have to get used to a new life where everyone and everything had to know everything. That was what village life was like, and there was nothing Jennifer could do about it. Jennifer guessed that after her visit to the post office, news of her arrival would spread throughout the village. "I'm going to live here," she decided that it was better to tell the truth at once than to answer a million more questions from the villagers. There were about 200 people living in the village. All of them had known the late Julia, and Jennifer herself might have to meet them all. Some she knew and remembered, some she had yet to make acquaintance with. Live Rachel's face stretched. "Why's that?" "You didn't fit in at the regional center." "No, it didn't," Jennifer sighed. "And we've got a paramedic about to retire." Now Rachel's face lit up with a happy smile. "Listen, you're a doctor. Why don't you come down to the paramedic station and talk to Sharon? She's just sitting there. She's almost 70 years old. She should be looking after her own health, not treating the villagers." Jennifer nodded, not really thinking about working at the paramedic station. In fact, she was more inclined to think about working in a nearby town that would have its own clinic. "Rachel, do you know who can help me with the cooker? I don't know how to use it. It's very cold in the house." "Is that what city folk mean?" Rachel grinned. "I think my Oliver can help you too." "Oliver?" Jennifer tried to remember a certain Oliver, but to no avail. "Yes, my son. He's just visiting me right now. He came back from his shift, and instead of going to his place, he's staying with me for the time being. Either he had a fight with his wife, or he just doesn't want to go home. Anyway, come to my place. He was supposed to chop wood today. And he'll give you some wood and help you with the stove." Jennifer thanked her neighbor and almost ran to her house. The thought of returning to a house that looked more like a huge glacier did not please her at all. "I don't want to fall down in these parts," Jennifer thought. "There are no proper hospitals here, no way to get a full checkup." Oliver was home. When Jennifer saw him through the fence, she didn't immediately recognize him as the boy she had once run to the river with. They had been 14 years old then. The boy seemed overly bold and brave, and he was a real bully. "And I recognized you straight away," Oliver smiled. "Remember when you almost drowned? And I saved you." Jennifer laughed. "I didn't drown. You didn't save me? You pushed me into the river yourself. But now you could very well save me. My cooker doesn't work in my house, and I have no idea how to use it. Will you help me?" Oliver agreed. Together they worked out how to use the cooker properly. Then they drank tea, laughing and reminiscing about their childhood and their childhood mischief. Afterwards, they discussed mutual acquaintances, about whose fate Oliver knew much more than Jennifer, who had lived in the regional center for a long time. Then the topic drifted to a discussion of her own personal life. Jennifer didn't go into details, only briefly told him that she had left her husband and would now try to start a new life. "But you're a risk taker," Oliver said admiringly. "To take a sudden change like that, I don't think I'm capable of that at all. You don't know the details, that's why you think that way, Jennifer replied sadly. Before she knew it, she was talking to her childhood friend and they sat there until lunchtime. The house was warm and cozy, and she didn't want to stop talking to such an interesting person. Jennifer suddenly realized that over the many years she had been married to Winston, she had completely forgotten what long, intimate conversations were like. After all, in the last few years, Winston was always busy. He had neither the time nor the inclination to talk to his wife. He must have discussed all the interesting things with Maggie, Jennifer thought bitterly, sinking back into her sad thoughts. And why are you stuck at your mother's? Why aren't you going home? Jennifer asked Oliver to distract herself from the realization of the worthlessness of her past life. Oliver shrugged. Honestly, I'm afraid to. My wife recently had a baby and I don't feel like I can handle it. Jennifer raised her eyebrows in surprise. You're afraid you won't be able to handle your own child? Are you serious? Oliver nodded. Seriously? Why? I'm a regular working man, my hands aren't made for this. When I pick up a pram, God forbid I drop it or push it. I'm afraid. Anyway, so I've been stalling. I fixed my mother's shed, rebuilt the roof. I'm thinking, what else can I do so I can go on shift right afterwards without going home? Oliver, it doesn't work that way, Jennifer shook her head. You put yourself in your wife's shoes. How does she feel? What does she think about you not going home? Her hormones are already raging right now. She's having a hard time, not getting enough sleep with a small child. And you didn't even come and see him? You want to, don't you? Oliver nodded, lowering his head. I want to, but I'm afraid to. You're a big man, and you're afraid of a small, helpless baby. Oliver, come on. You have a little brother, don't you? You spent your whole childhood with him, carrying him everywhere. Your mom almost left you with him forever. Nothing happened. I wasn't thinking straight then, Oliver said. I didn't have much choice. My parents made me do it. Now no one does. Yeah, Jennifer grinned. Did you ever think about the fact that your stressed out wife is going to take it upon herself not to let you on the doorstep when you finally get the courage to do it? Oliver looked at Jennifer, and his eyes grew wider and wider. Why wouldn't she let me in? I'm the husband. And where are you now? Are you the husband? Why are you sitting here? Not with your family, doing everything you can to avoid seeing your wife and child, Oliver. But she has every right to do the same, to never see you, Jennifer said. Oliver fell silent. There was nothing for him to object to. The next day, though, when Jennifer met Rachel, she learned from her that Oliver had gone to stay with his family. Packed up all his things dramatically yesterday and ran for the bus this morning. Thank God his brains are back in place. And that stuck out at my place, and at home a small son with his wife. Even I was embarrassed. Jennifer smiled and said nothing. As she walked to the shop, she thought about the fact that she might have made a husband and wife closer by bringing something good into the world. Now that she wasn't treating her patients, and she'd fled the city in disgrace, leaving her patients for other doctors, she felt guilty. The situation with Oliver at least redeemed that guilt a little. Entering the shop, Jennifer looked disappointedly at the shelves. She realized that village grocery shopping was going to be a disappointment. The shelves were lined with cereals, sugar, salt, washing powders, and shampoos. And it was impossible to buy the usual meat, frozen vegetable mixes, and dairy products. What are you going to buy? Jennifer was approached by a shop assistant, and in her Jennifer recognized her childhood friend Chloe. She recognized her with great difficulty because Chloe had changed so much. She and Jennifer were about the same age, except that Chloe was 1 or 2 years older. But she looked in her 30s and tails for all 45. The woman was clearly a heavy drinker. Her face was haggard, her eyes were red, and her hands were shaking, as if Chloe had drunk a lot the day before. Chloe, it's you. Isn't it? Jennifer asked instead of answering, and the woman tightened her lips and nodded faintly. Let's say it's me. What are you going to buy? I have a closing in 10 minutes, Chloe replied impolitely. Ah, closing time, Jennifer grinned to herself. Behind Chloe's back, she saw an open bottle of vodka on one of the shelves and next to it a shot glass and sliced apples. Chloe was clearly not going to close up to finish the day's work, but to get a hangover. "You've just changed so much," Jennifer said, continuing to insist and watching the way Chloe's eyes raced. "And you smell so heavy in here." "It's spoiled goods. It stinks from the back room," Chloe replied quickly, and then threw her chin up defiantly. "What are you doing here? Telling me off? Buy your food and go back to your place." "Rude," Jennifer said in an even voice, not trying to take offense at her former mate. "It's not my fault you look 40 years old. You have kids, don't you? My grandmother told me." "Look, get out of here," Chloe shouted. She ran out from behind the counter and forcefully pushed Jennifer towards the exit. "You're going to teach me about life. Idea girl, teach others." "Chloe, if you need help, come to me," Jennifer managed to say before the shop assistant slammed the shop door in her face. Having not bought anything from the shop, Jennifer decided that she would drive to a nearby town. The snow on the roads was already melting. She needed time to buy groceries and change the summer tires for winter ones. When she returned home in the evening, she noticed a female figure at the gate of Julia's grandmother's cottage. In the darkness, it was hard to make out who it was. But then Jennifer realized it was Chloe, the same one who had pushed her out of her shop back in the morning. "Let's go inside," Jennifer said, holding out 2 bags to Chloe. "Will you help me carry the groceries in?" Chloe obediently followed Jennifer in. At first, they sat in silence. Then Jennifer put the kettle on, poured tea into mugs, placed vases of sweets on the table. "Try some, they're delicious. I know they're very rare here. I used to buy them for the kids." Chloe suddenly burst into tears. Her shoulders were shaking, and Jennifer, silently watching the woman sitting opposite, got up from her chair, poured water into a glass and handed it to her guest. "Help me," Chloe pleaded. "I can't stop. Since Ben died, I've been going downhill. I know I should stop, but I can't. It's like there's a force in me that makes me drink vodka. I drink it, but it doesn't get easier, and I keep dreaming about Ben, and the children crying, and I can't control myself," Chloe said through her tears. Jennifer nodded. "Okay, I'll try to help you. Firstly, you're going to buy some pills in town. You're going to take them, and if you drink after them, they'll take you to the hospital. Secondly, they'll dull your desire to drink. We'll go into town together tomorrow. We'll make an appointment for you to see a doctor there. You should definitely do that. I'll drive you myself, go with you to the appointment, because I suspect you won't have the courage or strength to do it yourself." Chloe looked at Jennifer with wet eyes, nodded occasionally, and sipped water from the glass. "Are you really going to help me? Is that what you want? I want your children to grow up to be normal people, not afraid of their mother and not see everything that happens to you. You don't think about them as much as you usually do." "But you do," Jennifer said with a smile and handed Chloe a candy bar. "Take it, eat it, stay at my place tonight. You'll do something stupid like you did this morning and you'll be sorry." A few days after this conversation, when Jennifer and Chloe had already gone to the city, together went to the hospital, and Chloe was scheduled for treatment, people came to Jennifer's house. They all had different problems. Someone wanted to be cured of excessive alcohol consumption. Someone was worried about back pain. Someone in the stomach. In general, Chloe, who worked in the only shop in the village, encouraged after seeing a doctor and receiving help from Jennifer, told all the other residents about the dependability of her new friend and the fact that she worked in the regional center as a therapist. Jennifer never said no to anyone. And now the house of Masha's late grandmother turned into a kind of outpatient clinic. They brought her vegetables, meat, chicken, eggs. Someone tried to slip Jennifer money, but she took only food, and that is a thank you from happy old ladies who received prescriptions for medicines and learnt that they had no deadly diseases. Then Sharon, the same one who worked at the local health center as a paramedic, came to Jennifer's house. "Enough of this nonsense, Jenny," she said. "Did you get your employment history? Go to town and get you employed. I'm retiring. I've already written my application. And you shouldn't be taking people in and treating them with pickles in your house." Jennifer nodded. Totally agree with what Sharon said. She was going to go to town with the paperwork herself, but Sharon beat her to the punch with her suggestion. 2 weeks later, Jennifer was taking appointments at the local nursing station. She often thought about her old life, but she had no regrets. She had too much work to do, which finally gave her a burst of energy and a desire to move on with her life. In the course of her work, she managed to file for divorce, then received a certificate of divorce. She went to the regional center twice and fortunately did not meet her ex-husband or her sister. In conversations with her mother, Jennifer carefully avoided the topic of her past life. She never asked about Maggie, and Marion tactfully left out how her sister and ex-husband Winston lived. Jennifer didn't know about it and didn't want to know. She guessed that both Maggie and Winston knew perfectly well that Jennifer lived in the settlement. Only neither of them had ever come to her, repented or apologized. In February in the township, as the blizzards began, they came one after another, and the local authorities, unaccustomed to such bad weather, were surprised that by the end of winter, this time of year was just beginning to gain momentum. "It's a wicked winter," explained one of the old ladies who came to see Jennifer. "It doesn't want to go away. It fights spring. We always have snowfalls in February, so much snow. It melts quickly, but it doesn't get swept away by the wind. Be well." Jennifer nodded. She still had much to learn about village life, which she was finally starting to get used to after a few months. The village was peaceful, quiet, and life flowed at a measured pace. Jennifer liked her job, and now she knew everyone in the small village. "Thank you, Julia," they often said to her, referring to her grandmother. "Raised such a wonderful granddaughter. A pleasure to us all." Jennifer smiled modestly, not commenting on the patient's words. It did make her happy to know that her grandmother spoke so well of her. It meant she had lived a life worth living. One snowstorm, Jennifer left work early. The patients were gone, and a real snowstorm was brewing outside her window. After closing the nurse's station, Jennifer trudged through the snowdrifts towards her home. As she approached, she noticed the open gate, but thought that it had opened because of strong gusts of wind. However, as she stepped up onto the porch, she saw the door to the house open. "What the hell is that?" she muttered as she approached the door, and then noticed a man's boots at the entrance. Her heart sank. As if in slow motion, she walked into the house and saw Winston sitting at the table. Turning around, he looked at her with an intimidated look, then gave her a strained smile. "Sorry, I'm uninvited." And Jennifer stopped in the doorway and leaned helplessly with her back against the door. It was unclear whether her strength had left her from the arduous journey home or because of her ex-husband's arrival. "Why did you come?" With difficulty moving her lips, she asked. "I came to beg forgiveness," he replied, rising from his chair. "I wanted to come sooner, but I lacked courage. Forgive me." Outside the window, the elements raged. Jennifer wanted to push Winston out the door, to slam the door in his face as Chloe had once done to her. But the blizzard was too frightening, and she wouldn't dare throw a man out into the weather and put his life in danger, even if she very much wanted to hurt someone who had once hurt herself. "I forgave you long ago," Jennifer replied. "I've already forgotten about everything, and I advise you to forget about everything. Live happily ever after," Jennifer said. "I even left myself to give you the opportunity to be a happy husband and father of your child." "Maggie is not pregnant by me," Winston replied. "I can't have children. All these years I haven't told you the truth. My first wife left me for that reason, and I was afraid of losing you, so I kept quiet. Maggie's pregnancy, by which she wanted to keep me, was a consequence of her frivolous life." Jennifer grinned. "You chose that girl, now take responsibility for it yourself. I don't want to know anything." Winston approached Jennifer and tried to take her hands, but she took a step backwards. Then he suddenly dropped to his knees, lowering his head and holding out his hands to his ex-wife. Jennifer cringed, seeing the pathetic picture before her. How many times had she imagined Winston begging her forgiveness? But now this moment had come, and she felt nothing but squeamishness and a desire to end this spectacle as soon as possible. "Come on, get off your knees, it won't do you any good," she said. "I realized exactly why you were here today. You took advantage of the bad weather so I couldn't kick you out, but it won't help you." Winston lifted his head and looked into her face. "Do you really like this life? Do you like living in the township, socializing with these uneducated and miserable people? You are a doctor with a capital letter." "Shut up," Jennifer interrupted him. "It's not for you to talk about how bad people live here. You're not known for your own integrity. And I could have been a doctor with a capital letter if I'd gone on to further study. You talked me out of it. Now I'm going to be a little doctor in this little village. I'm leaving. And I want you gone by the time I get back. You put the key back where you got it from." Jennifer walked out of the house, breathing heavily and gulping for air. It was hard to walk, the wind whipping in her face, filling her eyes with snow. But Jennifer didn't stop, stepping firmly through the loose snow. After a few minutes, having overcome a snowdrift almost a meter high, she knocked on the door of Chloe's house. Half an hour later, they were sitting at the table drinking tea. "So, did you really kick him out?" Chloe asked. "I asked him to go home. I didn't kick him out," replied Jennifer. "I can't live with a man who betrayed me once. If I do, I'll be constantly expecting him to betray me again. No, I can't do that. If my Ben were alive, I think I would forgive him for the sake of our children," Chloe said then, sobbing, and put her arm around Jennifer's shoulders, rocking her like a child. "We don't have children, and there's no point in our marriage," Jennifer replied. "Winston can't have children." After saying those words and looking at Chloe's 2 kids playing cars on the bed in the room, Jennifer smiled. She wants kids. She wants to live a happy new life where there will be no room for betrayal. It was necessary to wait a little while. And sooner or later, a big love was sure to appear in her little life. Cynthia noticed it a long time ago. Sometimes strange and sometimes even inexplicable events happen in the surgery department. A person is brought in, and it seems that he has only 5 minutes to live, maybe even less. Especially if he is seriously injured or the disease is too neglected. Then everything depends not only on the doctor, but also on the favorable coincidence of circumstances. Of course, we cannot say that in such almost hopeless situations, the doctor should rely only on help from above. No, in severe cases, the surgeon relies on his own knowledge and experience, not forgetting that you need to act decisively without wasting time. Such was the case with Johnny, a homeless man admitted to the ward 2 days ago, just as Cynthia was on night duty. "Cynthia, there's something wrong," Megan ran into the resident's room and exclaimed. Cynthia looked at the nurse in surprise. Megan was new to the department, but she had already proved herself to be a good nurse. She was not afraid of heavy patients and had a strong nerve. "What's up?" "Did you see a ghost?" Cynthia asked with a touch of irony. "I wish I had. There's a homeless man, wounded, penetrating stab wound, came in and collapsed on the floor. Right in the emergency room," Megan blurted out. Cynthia's face changed immediately when she heard that. In a case like this, every second counts. You can't afford to delay. Prep the operating theater. "I'll be right there," she said. "But we're a private clinic. Should we call the police?" The nurse hesitated. "We will, but later. Right now we have to save the victim. We'll do the rest afterwards," Cynthia said rather stiffly. The nurse nodded in agreement and hurried to carry out the doctor's orders. Cynthia, on the other hand, hesitated. A stab wound in a homeless man. Cynthia wondered. The clinic was indeed private. And what would Superintendent Walter have to say about it tomorrow morning? As head of the clinic, they're tight-knit. Paid rooms, overpriced medication. Even though the clinic is private. She's going to get in trouble for that surgery. All right, so now we're just going to leave poor Johnny bleeding in the street. What about the doctor's oath? No. Whatever happens. Cynthia decided to take action and began to prepare for the operation. Johnny looked to be in his early 30s. He had no time to give his name or the circumstances of his injuries. After all, he had only managed to get to the clinic and collapsed on the floor. Cynthia realized at once that the injury was serious. According to statistics, the lethal outcome of such abdominal injuries is almost 80%. This meant that the operation was likely to fail. The nurse who was to be her assistant realized this. But Cynthia was certainly not going to give up early. She was determined to fight on, no matter what. The operation was complicated. In Cynthia's memory, there were only 2 of those. For a long time, she couldn't stop the bleeding, which threatened to kill the patient. As it turned out later, Johnny had a rare blood type, which made the task much more difficult. A couple of times, Cynthia wanted to let go of the clamp and simply burst into tears, admitting to herself that there was nothing she could do. Probably such moments occur in the life of everyone who has ever been on the verge of despair. Sensing the doctor's condition, the operating nurse tried not to lose her composure and clearly fulfill all tasks. At one point, there was even a threat of cardiac arrest in the patient, but Cynthia coped. She was able to normalize vital signs and did the near impossible. By the end of the 4-hour surgery, she was barely on her feet from fatigue and despite her inner tension. "Cynthia, we won." "Are you a real magician?" said the operating room nurse Veronica with a smile. "Oh, come on, you don't say." "That's not me, just lucky," replied Cynthia. "But my grandmother, Mrs. Amanda, a field surgeon, was a magician. She was the one who could get even the most hopeless back on their feet." The rest of the shift flew by. Johnny was surprisingly strong and was clearly going to pull through. After checking his condition, Cynthia nodded with satisfaction. "There you'll live. The main thing is to make sure that the lesson is good for you. Many people don't notice such signs of doom." Naturally, the patient could not respond to the doctor's remark, as he was in a medically induced coma. Cynthia could only hope that Johnny would accept her mental attitude. A new day began and new troubles began. Soon the clinic was filling up again with the medical staff who had come on shift during the day. Here Cynthia was in for a very unpleasant surprise. When the police officers, together with Walter, arrived at the ward, they interviewed the nurse on duty and carefully recorded her statements. They spoke to Megan and Veronica, who, while admiring Cynthia's professionalism, put it all out there. "Cynthia, you've caused us a lot of trouble. Why did you get involved with that homeless guy?" Walter, the superintendent, hissed. "What's wrong, Walter?" "Well, what was I supposed to do in that case?" Cynthia asked him in surprise. He looked at her with undisguised anger. "What's wrong, Cynthia?" "Everything is wrong. That tramp is a wanted man, you know. He's kidnapped the 8-year-old son of a businessman, Mr. Jonathan Henderson. The CCTV footage shows the tramp taking the boy to the park. And after that, Bruce Henderson was never seen again. You get it? This Johnny of yours is a murderer and a criminal who should be tried on the spot. What makes you think he had anything to do with the kidnapping? Maybe it wasn't like that." Cynthia frowned. "Oh, don't be ridiculous, Cynthia. It wasn't like that. And what was it like then? Pray tell. If you'd had children of your own, then you'd know that little boys shouldn't go out with tramps," Walter exclaimed angrily. At the mention of children, Cynthia's face darkened. She really had no children, so it was a blow to the heart, but that was not what upset her. It was that the Henderson family name was familiar to her. Her husband, Kevin, had recently considered himself a business associate of Mr. Jonathan Henderson. Cynthia herself was not acquainted with the businessman, but she had heard very conflicting information about him. It was said that Mr. Jonathan Henderson had made his fortune through his wife, Kimberly, who had left him a substantial inheritance and a successful business. The sound of the door opening brought her out of her troubled musings. Kevin was standing on the threshold. His eyes were glowing with anger. "What have you done, Cynthia? Why did you save that bastard?" he blurted out. "There's no place to test him." Walter gloomed and quietly left the office, leaving Cynthia alone with her husband.
Kevin, why are you talking to me like that? Did I give you any reason to? Her face contorted with anger. You've got to be kidding me. What excuse do you need? You saved a criminal, you know. And Jonathan Henderson doesn't forgive that. He'll kill you. He'll grind you to a pulp. Just remember, Kevin said. Today you're a doctor, tomorrow you could be in jail. Kevin, are you threatening me? Cynthia turned pale. I didn't do anything wrong, she whispered. And who rescued that tramp? Do you think the police didn't notice? No, they didn't. A private clinic, a surgeon. Tell me, why did he come to your shift? Why did he choose a private clinic instead of going to the city hospital? Maybe the drifter was counting on something? Or knew something? Cynthia turned pale. Frankly speaking, she had not expected her husband to talk to her in such a way, which turned into a real interrogation. Could she have done anything differently? Should she have left the man to bleed to death? Even if he was a criminal, how could she know that Johnny was involved in some kind of kidnapping? Although the accusation against him sounds naive to say the least. Just because a boy was seen with a tramp doesn't mean anything. The boy could have just got lost and wandered off. After all, someone hurt Johnny himself, and it's unlikely it was an 8-year-old boy. Especially since, according to Kevin, Bruce walked beside the tramp completely voluntarily. And that's saying something. Cynthia's mood finally soured. Mr. Jonathan was not a man to be trifled with. Neither did the head doctor of the clinic, who was his friend. It didn't take long for Mr. Miles to be summoned, unlike Walter and her husband. He didn't beat around the bush and informed me that Cynthia had been retroactively fired. But I was just doing my job, she whispered. And I don't care what you were doing, Cynthia. I don't want any trouble, especially not with Jonathan Henderson. Bruce is his adopted son. His wife's dead. He's become a stepfather to the boy. You see, the tramp's unconscious, but they're going to move him to the prison hospital, and they're looking for the boy. So I had to take action, you know. You'll probably get a criminal record. Jonathan Henderson's going to take it to court. He thinks you were in cahoots with that poor bloke. It's not for nothing that he came to you for help, Mr. Miles said without a trace of embarrassment. Cynthia's eyes brimmed with tears. What does that mean? She could be dismissed from her job just like that. What for? Anyone in her position would have done the same thing. She's a medical professional. Unfortunately, Cynthia couldn't change her boss's mind. How could she? When you're accused and called an accomplice by your own husband, Kevin. Of course, he was clearly overreacting. They'd had a lot of fights before. But it's never gone this far. Was the husband so dependent on this Jonathan Henderson that he could talk like this? It's unthinkable. Just like that, like a magic wand. The effect of a successful operation was replaced by bitter disappointment. Cynthia looked longingly at Johnny, handcuffed to the hospital gurney, and smiled sadly. The tramp was just coming round and helplessly trying to find his savior with his eyes, though it was far from certain that he remembered her face. After all, during the initial examination before the operation, Johnny had been unconscious, delirious the whole time. The dismissal process took a little while. Mr. Miles, eager to please Jonathan Henderson, did everything he could to get Cynthia on the street as soon as possible. Understandably so. The far-sighted head doctor was trying to protect himself from possible repercussions. This way, he could just resign retroactively and be done with it. Cynthia walked out of the clinic and exposed her tear-wet face to the sun. Passers-by passed by and looked in amazement at the young woman with sad gray eyes, who was crying. I didn't feel like going home. After the conversation with Kevin, her soul longed for peace and quiet, but she didn't want to listen to reproaches and accusations. She'd had enough of that. Thank you all for your efforts. Not much to say, for in the middle of the day, silence could only be found in a city park. Cynthia crossed to the opposite side of the street and headed to her desired location. Thanks to the nice weather, the park was crowded. Elderly people, couples strolling around, taking pictures of each other against the backdrop of the surrounding beauty, and people who just wanted to be alone with nature. There was a huge fountain in the middle of the park, which provided everyone with a pleasant freshness. Children cheered and squealed, while adults looked on with a smile, remembering themselves as children. Cynthia's mood lightened a little. She walked over to the hot bakery stand and bought a couple of scones to feed the swans and the squirrels scurrying around. The last time she'd done that was a few years ago when she'd first met Kevin. Back then, in that time of romance and bouquets of flowers, they'd taken many walks, visited cafes and cinemas. But all that was in the past. Kevin was very different now. Now he spent a lot of time at work. And when he came home, he often turned into a silent, sullen man. Kevin used to save money on little things, but now he put money aside for everything he could and couldn't afford. And this despite the fact that Cynthia earned a good salary at the private clinic where she had transferred 3 years ago. During that time, she had never regretted her decision. However, the transfer itself was initiated by her husband, who knew her head doctor personally. "How long will you hump in this city surgery?" "A private surgeon has more money and a higher status," Kevin said. Cynthia was hesitant for a long time because she had done her internship in the Department of Surgery, and in fact it was her way into life, but on the other hand, she did not want to stand still either. After all, the saying goes, "Under the lying stone does not flow water." Only now she realized that her husband Kevin thought only about money, and the transfer to a private clinic had been initiated by him for that very reason. Now that his business interests had intersected with his wife's work, Kevin did not hesitate to do everything he could to defame her. Well, couldn't he have stepped in and said a word? Cynthia thought of Mr. Jonathan. She didn't know the answer to her question, especially as relations with her husband had been rather strained of late. Perhaps this was due to the frequent visits and interference of her mother-in-law, Mrs. Kimberly, who came whenever she pleased, and most often on days when Cynthia was resting from her night's duty. Yet Mrs. Kimberly had a constant thirst for activity that had nothing to do with hard work or a love of cleanliness. Most likely she just wanted to find some flaw in Cynthia's impeccable reputation to reproach her for it. For instance, Mrs. Kimberly could easily initiate a general cleaning, knowing full well that Cynthia had returned from a heavy shift. She also never missed a family party so that she could turn up and do her bit. Naturally, Cynthia was patient, as many daughters-in-law are in this world. Showing character right away was not something she wanted to do. She valued Kevin and realized that it was unlikely that her mother-in-law would love her as her own daughter. So she had to take everything for granted and put up with the fact that Mrs. Kimberly was gradually making her life a living hell. A separate topic of conversation from the mouth of her mother-in-law was childlessness. At first it was innocent talk with an undercurrent that hinted very vaguely that Cynthia was infertile. Then Mrs. Kimberly had the courage to speak of it directly. "Look, Cynthia, when do you think you'll have children? You're what, 30, 35? Are you going to go to your son's graduation party when you're retired?" Mrs. Kimberly said ironically. Cynthia turned pale. "Well, you know very well it's not up to us. First one course of treatment, then another. And the case, as they say, hasn't moved," she said. Mrs. Kimberly grinned. Well, let's see what's going on there, because my friends are already laughing at me. When are you going to be a grandmother? They are about to marry their grandchildren, and you still can't get pregnant." Cynthia's tears welled up with resentment. What could she say when medicine was powerless in these cases? No, she had once suggested to Kevin that he take a child from the orphanage, but he had flatly refused. "No, Cynthia, it's not for me. I don't like these adoptions. I don't know what kind of heredity they have. Who are their parents? What if they're criminals or worse, alcoholics? It's all in the genes. And what do you want us to be taken care of in our old age by some moron who will wait for my pension?" Cynthia shook her head. You shouldn't say that. I don't think that's true. Children don't inherit the traits of their biological parents, especially if they are taken from an orphanage right after birth. Kevin looked at her as if she'd said something stupid. Of course, it's easy for you to judge from the outside. I have a business to run, and I need a proper heir. And who do you suggest I take an alcoholic, a vagrant? How can I give him my business, which I've been developing for so many years? Kevin was indignant. Cynthia blushed to the roots of her hair. Honey, did you ever think that your son might grow up to be even more successful than you? Become an asset to the business? Maybe even more successful than you and me combined, she suggested. Kevin pressed his lips together resentfully. The notion that some foster child might be better than he was offended him to the core. No, it wouldn't be like that. All those foster kids would be just as much losers as their parents. The parents will drink, party, spend money, and then go to jail. They'll come back with tuberculosis. No, I don't want that kind of pleasure for nothing. He cut him off. Perhaps if her mother-in-law had not been on her husband's side, Cynthia might have persuaded him to take the baby from the orphanage. But since Mrs. Kimberly was also against it, Cynthia's chances were practically nil. Her mother-in-law, on the other hand, took real aesthetic pleasure in hurting Cynthia time after time by talking about the children. She would suddenly begin to speculate aloud about what kind of nursery she would like for her grandchildren, or she would talk about the beautiful pram her friends' grandchildren had, and also that she would like to give her grandchildren to the 10th kindergarten, and not to the 3rd. Cynthia was pulled out of a state of sad reflection by someone's quiet, ingratiating voice. Auntie, I suppose you like to feed the birds? Cynthia turned round and saw a girl of about 7 behind her, wearing a dress 2 sizes too big and old, worn-out sandals. Yeah, do you want to join us? Come on, let's go. We'll feed the birds and then the squirrel. Do you know how funny they are? Replied Cynthia. The little girl suddenly tensed up and looked round, then looked again at the 2 buns that Cynthia had thoughtfully bought for the birds. Little Elizabeth looked at Cynthia in such a way that she felt uneasy. There was too much longing in the eyes of this girl who stood in the park and looked at the treats with hungry eyes. Would you like me to buy you a bun? Cynthia asked slowly and cautiously. The little stranger nodded happily. Of course. But I'd like to have 2 buns. For my brother, he's staying with his grandmother. I went to look for something to eat, the girl replied. My grandmother is sick and my parents are dead. Sometimes I work in the park, though my grandmother swears. But what can I do? Do you want? I can dance or recite a poem. Cynthia's heart ached for the little girl. Oh, really? Come on, just take it for free. Do you want me to go to the shop and buy your brother whatever you want? I'll get you some juice. What are you going to eat? If not, let's go to a cafe and have a proper meal, she suggested. What's your name anyway? I'm Cynthia. You can just call me Aunt Cynthia. The girl paused, as if gathering her strength and thinking whether to tell this strange woman her name or not. At last the little girl said, And I'm Elizabeth. Elizabeth Harris. We live near here, in the old annex. We used to have a big house, but it burned down and the firemen were able to save the outhouse. My grandmother and I live there, and we've recently had a baby brother. Cynthia looked at the little girl in surprise. A baby brother? You said your parents died. He must be little. What is he, a year old? Elizabeth smiled and took a bun from Cynthia's hands and took a bite. No, little brother's almost as old as me. He's 8 years old. His name is Bruce. He's a new arrival, but his grandmother took him in. What's he going to do? Wander the streets on his own? It's nice and cozy in our annex. It's not hot in summer, warm in winter, and the stove burns so hot that I even sleep without a blanket. True, we have to prepare firewood from summer, but we manage, the girl continued. Cynthia found the girl's story strange. She was even more alarmed by the boy's name, Bruce. Wasn't he the same Bruce who had disappeared because of Johnny the Tramp? Cynthia wanted to ask the question directly, but then decided to proceed more cautiously. After all, she was talking to a small child who could be frightened or traumatized by an awkward word. There weren't many street kids in town with the name Bruce. Maybe it's a different kid who has taken up with her granddaughter's grandmother in search of sustenance. "What's your grandmother's name, Elizabeth?" Cynthia asked cautiously. "Mrs. Amanda," the girl answered readily. Cynthia smiled. "Can I speak to your grandmother? Don't be afraid. I won't do anything bad to you. I'll just buy some groceries and bring them home to you. And if necessary, I'll go get some medicine for your grandma. I'm actually a doctor." Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise. "What did you say? You're a doctor? Wow. Then of course let's go to Grandma's house. See if you can give her some advice or give her the right medicine. She's treating herself. You know, she has these little ulcers on her legs. If you don't treat them, they get bigger. I don't even know what it's called." Cynthia shook her head sadly. "It's probably trophic ulcers. They often haunt the elderly. I understand. If necessary, I'll write the right prescription and prescribe treatment. I'm actually a surgeon, but I think in your grandmother's case it might be possible to do without surgery," Cynthia said. Elizabeth listened carefully, as if she understood every word. Cynthia went to the shop and bought a huge bag of groceries before going to the house. Like any smart, thrifty woman, she took everything she needed to make a proper lunch, dinner, and breakfast. As it turned out, Elizabeth really lived not far from the city park and the place where it smoothly passed into the private sector, where several dozen houses, similar to each other as twin brothers, were coastally settled. However, the annex in which the grandmother and granddaughter lived stood out even against the background of all the other buildings because it was very small, and of course old and in need of repair. Cynthia realized this as soon as she approached the gate. The roof had rotted away and was covered with old slate, which was probably also leaking and letting in moisture. The panes of glass were dirty and in places covered with cracks that had been covered with sticky tape for safety. The squeaky door was creaking, and Cynthia thought it might as well not be closed at all, especially in the summertime. There was nothing to steal from the house, and it was unlikely that any burglars would attempt this inconspicuous outbuilding. As soon as she stepped through the door, Cynthia could smell the strong odor of medicine. Like any medical man, she considered them an indispensable part of her life. Letting Elizabeth go, Cynthia followed with the bag of groceries. The little girl took a few timid steps and then said, "Grandma, hello. I brought you a doctor. She is a surgeon. She knows how to treat your illness." For a moment, there was a tense pause in the room. Then someone's tired, elderly voice answered, "Thank you. Is it convenient for her to come to our house? This isn't the right place at all. Oh, it's embarrassing." Cynthia smiled and immediately hastened to defuse the situation. "Oh, come on, Mrs. Amanda. I'm a doctor. I don't care about your surroundings and the fact that there are no repairs. That's not what I'm interested in. Let me examine you and tell you what can be done and what medication to prescribe. You may even have to take a course of medication," said Cynthia. Mrs. Amanda looked at her guest doubtfully. "Well, I don't know. I've been on my own for a long time. I can't walk to the hospital. We don't have a car either. And there's no one to take care of me but Elizabeth." But Cynthia nodded and looked pityingly at the old woman. Of course, she knew how hard it was for her to be alone with her little granddaughter. Now they had a little homeless child with them. If Mrs. Amanda had a daughter or a son, they would have taken her to the hospital and seen a doctor. And so she could only rely on herself and on the help of her underage granddaughter, who needs to go to school, not wander around the park and beg. "All right, let's get to the examination. Where can I wash my hands?" Cynthia asked businesslike. The old woman hesitated for a moment and then asked Elizabeth to show her the bathroom. On her way to it, Cynthia caught a glimpse of the boy in the next room, who was huddled in a corner, clearly afraid of her presence. This fact was extremely alarming. There was something wrong with this, no matter how she looked at it. Usually street children do not behave like this, because the street promotes the development of courage and inconsideration in them, which gives them the right to beg and ask people for anything they want. This boy seemed quiet and a little scared. And he was also clearly wary of Cynthia, who in his mind was a danger in his own home. Cynthia proceeded to inspect, of course, aware that Mrs. Amanda's legs had probably already developed trophic ulcers. Nevertheless, what she saw shocked her even as an experienced medical surgeon. The situation was aggravated by the fact that Mrs. Amanda was unable to buy expensive medicines. So she used the ones that were absolutely useless in her situation. Not only that, but she was self-medicating, which in itself is very dangerous. You know, Mrs. Amanda, I'd advise you to go to hospital. I'll prescribe the right medication and ointments, but you may need a blood test along with a whole range of other tests. These will help to determine the true picture of the illness, Cynthia began. Mrs. Amanda looked longingly at her guest. I'm sorry, but how do you envisage it? Who's going to take me? You'd have to hire a taxi to get to the hospital. And you know what they're charging these days. My pension is small. I've been a cook for almost 30 years. I'm always on my feet, so I earned it. I'd keep working. I can't stand anymore, and I can't find a sedentary job. Let me tell you about the accident that killed my kids. They just bought a second-hand car. They had been saving up for it for several years, and then they took to the motorway and went to a neighboring town for a visit. A drunk driver drove into oncoming traffic. It was a no-win situation. It's a good thing Elizabeth was with me, or I wouldn't be alive right now. I'd have someone to take care of me. Elizabeth and that boy are the only ones left. At the mention of the boy, Cynthia shuddered. Perhaps this was a chance to make inquiries about him, but it must be done as quietly as possible so he wouldn't hear. Look, Mrs. Amanda, do you know Bruce's surname or how you came to have him in the first place? Mrs. Amanda looked anxiously at Cynthia. Look, isn't he the reason you're here? Maybe you're not a doctor at all. If you want Bruce to have him, I'm not giving him to anyone. Johnny brought him to me because he said he needed help. And I've known Johnny a long time. He's a good man. He wouldn't do anything bad to us. He told me the boy needed help. So he did. I remember Johnny when he was a teenager. He used to come into my canteen for a snack. He was like a son. But then he got mixed up with a bad crowd, went to jail, did some time, but then he got his head on straight. Except Johnny's stepdad drank up Johnny's flat. That's how he ended up on the street. At the mention of the boy, Cynthia turned pale. At that moment, she realized that Johnny didn't really mean to hurt anyone, but had other aims. Immediately, a rather slender picture began to form in her mind of what might have really happened. For some reason, guessing that little Bruce needed help, Johnny had decided to hide him at his acquaintance's house, and then he was the victim of a robbery that nearly cost him his life. Mrs. Amanda, don't even think about it. I don't want to take anyone away from you. It's just that I operated on Johnny tonight. He's been stabbed in the stomach, you know, and they're accusing him of kidnapping Bruce. If you'll let me, I'd like to talk to the boy and find out what happened, Cynthia said, hardly able to contain her excitement. Mrs. Amanda turned pale. Of course, dear, talk. My God, what's happened to my neighbor? He was like a son to me. Who'd lay a hand on him? He's so kind by nature he wouldn't hurt a fly. And then he gets a knife in the stomach. Cynthia, seeing the worry in the old woman's eyes, hastened to reassure her. No, don't worry, he'll live. I'm sure the operation was a success, although it was hard around 4 in the morning. I came straight from the night shift to see you today. I was sacked for that case, but don't worry, I'll write your prescriptions without all that red tape. You know what I mean? You are treated not with the medicines you have at home now, but with the ones you need in your case. You're making things worse for yourself. And if this keeps going on, it could come to, I don't even want to talk about it. I mean, amputation, you know? Mrs. Amanda had tears in her eyes. Unfortunately, like many elderly people, she was afraid to go to the doctor and decided to treat herself. Leaving her grandmother with her grandson for a while, Cynthia left the room and approached a frightened Bruce. My name is Cynthia. And you're Bruce, aren't you? The boy nodded timidly and looked at her with the look of a hunted wolf cub. Realizing that he was unlikely to say anything, Cynthia continued the conversation. Bruce, I'm sorry to ask you this directly, but Uncle Johnny, who helped you, didn't kidnap you, did he? At the mention of Johnny, Bruce's eyes flashed with joy. No, not at all. Of course he didn't kidnap me. He and I were just hanging out, and Uncle Johnny was always helping. Once he brought a squirrel to my house and showed it through the window, and carved toys out of wood, and little things like that. Anyway, he kept me entertained. Cynthia raised an eyebrow in surprise. Entertained you? Why couldn't you go and entertain yourself? And why did he keep pointing out the window? Bruce gloomed. Well, how can I tell you? My stepfather wouldn't let me go outside. I stayed home all day long. All I could do was open the window a little bit to get some fresh air and see what was going on outside. That's when I met Uncle Johnny. He often went about his business and I waved at him. One wave at first, and then we started greeting each other. And one day I managed to open the window more than usual, and I talked to him. The boy's rambling story brought tears to Cynthia's eyes. She had expected to hear anything but this. The boy had been held hostage by his stepfather, who kept him locked up like a golden cage. Bruce, why didn't your stepfather let you go outside? Were you misbehaving? Cynthia asked cautiously. The boy shook his head resolutely. No, I was behaving well. I even went to school. And then my stepfather suddenly decided that I shouldn't be shown to people, locked me up at home, and arranged with the school principal for me to study remotely. When I didn't do well, I had a tutor come to me. Actually, Uncle Jonathan is not my real father, he's my stepfather. You see, his aunt comes to him all the time. She doesn't like me and locks me in a room when they meet, drinks wine, watches TV, and I have to sit quiet as a mouse and not make any noise. At that moment, Cynthia felt uneasy. Just the thought of Bruce having fun with some girl and his adopted son sitting around waiting for it to be over made Cynthia uncomfortable. She thought for a moment, then asked, Bruce, can you tell anyone else about this if you need to? You know, like the police or the courts? The boy looked at her eagerly. Of course I can. I'd just like to see Uncle Johnny because we came here and then he disappeared. Cynthia frowned, not knowing whether to tell the truth or not, but then, weighing up the pros and cons, she told him what had really happened. A tear immediately rolled down Bruce's cheek. Will he live? Aunt Cynthia? Uncle Johnny, he's a good man, he can't die. She smiled. Of course, I promise. There are different cases, of course, but of this I am 100% sure. Your Uncle Johnny is a real fighter. He's got a grip on life like no other. So you can be proud of him, and I can be proud of you. But now I guess I'd better get going. I have to go to the pharmacy and get some medicine for your grandmother, and then I'll be back. You stay here, don't go anywhere. You've got enough groceries for now. I'm going to try and deal with your stepfather. At the mention of him, Bruce suddenly turned pale and looked anxiously at his guest. Maybe you shouldn't. Or at least be careful, okay? What's wrong with him? Cynthia asked in surprise. Bruce hesitated for a moment, but then said, "He's not a good man. When my mom got sick, Uncle Jonathan wouldn't let her go to the doctor, brought him home. In fact, I don't think he was a doctor, he was a gangster. He had blue tattoos on his arms. You know, you don't, but he did." Cynthia tried to keep her cool. She nodded demurely. To tell the truth, she wanted to make a scene with Mr. Jonathan, who pretended to be a prominent businessman, but was in fact a common criminal. And her husband Kevin was a good man too, finding himself such a companion. I can't tell you. Warning Mrs. Amanda that she was going to the pharmacy, Cynthia left the house and breathed in the fresh air. After the stuffy atmosphere of the dark outbuilding, the street seemed to her a paradisiacal place. Entering the pharmacy, she recalled from memory the list of medicines she needed for her treatment. It should be said that all the drugs from this group were freely available. That is, did not require a prescription. But for some reason, the pharmacist refused to give her the medicine. "They are freely available," Cynthia objected. "I'm a doctor, so I'm the one who made the prescription. If you doubt me, I work at a private clinic called Avicenna." "Well, I should say I used to work at Avicenna," she mumbled embarrassedly, thinking, and then decided to call the pharmacy manager. For a moment, Cynthia felt that a scandal was unlikely to be avoided. The superintendent turned out to be a woman in her 40s. Her fingers were covered with rings, and around her neck she wore a braided chain with a massive heart-shaped pendant. "Is there a problem?" the superintendent asked. Cynthia was convinced that this was going to be a confrontational conversation. "Yes, I want to buy these medicines, and they won't let me have them," she said. The manager frowned. "They won't release them, you say? You should know that you need a prescription to buy such drugs." So the employee is absolutely right. And if you don't have a prescription, you can go to another pharmacy. Cynthia's lips trembled. "Look, you must have misunderstood something. I am a doctor and I know what medicines are on the market. Mrs. Amanda needs them for her tropical ulcers from an allergic reaction. And you're stalling and stalling instead of giving us a chance to cure this woman," Cynthia said with annoyance. "My name is Cynthia, and I'm a doctor, a surgeon at the Avicenna private clinic. You may have heard of it?" Emily shook her head doubtfully. Then she thought about it, picked up the phone, and decided to call Mr. Miles, the doctor. Cynthia waited nervously. In the meantime, the superintendent was already talking to the chief physician, and as her face changed, Cynthia realized that she was likely to be denied her medication. Unfortunately, her premonition had not deceived her. Finished speaking, Emily forcefully put down the receiver of the machine. Then she walked over to Cynthia and said, with emphasized contempt, "Look, you're an ex-doctor, so I don't need to be the one who's trying to push my way in here. If you don't like it, nobody's keeping you here, and if you resent it, I'll call security. You're just pretending to be a doctor. She's a doctor. How come you got fired? And what's more, you're facing a criminal offense, and you want to drag me down with you? No, sweetheart, you go back to where you came from. You'll get no help from me." Cynthia's eyes welled up with tears from the offense. What's that supposed to mean? She can't buy medicine anymore. She slammed the door in her face and went to the next pharmacy, which was a few hundred meters away. There she was sold the medicine without any problems. However, her mood was already hopelessly ruined. She wanted to do the best to help an elderly person, but it turned out quite the opposite. On the way back, the telephone in her purse rang. Cynthia wondered who it could be. She picked up the receiver and heard the familiar voice of her mother-in-law, Mrs. Kimberly. "Hello, Cynthia. Where have you been? I've been waiting for you from work for an hour. I bought some cleaning products. I thought I'd clean the windows today and maybe the floors. Your place is such a mess, and you're nowhere to be found. I called Kevin. He doesn't know anything. You've been a little too free lately. You're not out there, are you?" 'Cause I've seen a lot of you doctors in my time. I know what you do on your night shifts." And that was the last straw for Cynthia. "What night watch? What are you getting at, Mrs. Kimberly? Don't you know what happened today?" She was outraged. "I operated on a patient at 4 a.m. who came into the clinic with a stab wound to the abdomen. And you're accusing me of infidelity?" "Yes, if you have any doubts, you can inquire at the registrar's office, or even call the head doctor himself. He'll tell you what really happened." Mrs. Kimberly realized she'd overstepped her bounds. However, her mother-in-law was never very good at apologizing, so she decided that the best defense was attack. "Don't raise your voice at me. I'm not your maid. If I said I'm coming today, then be ready and wait for me. Like I have to clean your windows, your fridge is a mess. Don't you have time to cook something? Kevin's gonna get an ulcer from an empty stomach." Cynthia just burst into flames. "No, Mrs. Kimberly, your Kevin won't get an ulcer," she said. "He only eats at restaurants. He doesn't eat much at home. He comes home at midnight. I've cooked for him a few times, but nobody eats but me. You know, it's not very nice to work all night and then sit alone waiting for your husband to come home." But Mrs. Kimberly couldn't be persuaded. As mothers-in-law often do, it's always the son-in-law who's closest. And no matter what the daughter-in-law did, it was useless. It felt like she was about to explode with anger. Cynthia interrupted the call and put the phone away in her purse. Once again, her mother-in-law had done everything she could to humiliate her, once again to assert herself at someone else's expense. Of course, Cynthia didn't know that Mrs. Kimberly was actually jealous of her. After all, her sister-in-law had been to medical school. Mrs. Kimberly had a technical degree and a job as a seamstress in a factory. However, she worked there for a short time and left the place when the country was gripped by the thirst for commerce and business. She divorced when Kevin was 2 years old, and the reason for the divorce was that the father of her child was paid too little. Mrs. Kimberly, on the other hand, would only settle for $1 million she had never seen in her life. Is it any wonder that Kevin grew up to be so greedy and unscrupulous about running a business? After all, we can only guess what his mother had to go through in order to accumulate the initial capital, which the son then led in the development of his own business. Back at Mrs. Amanda's, Cynthia set about dressing and treating the wounds on the sick woman's legs. Of course, a nurse on the ward would do this, but as Cynthia was now alone, she had no other choice. "Cynthia, thank you so much. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't know what to do. I can see it's bad, but I haven't told Elizabeth about it so as not to frighten her. I don't want the girl to cry and be afraid I'll be gone," grandmother said with feeling. Cynthia smiled and replied quietly, "Don't worry, Mrs. Amanda, everything will be all right. The medicine will kick in now and you'll feel better. But it's too soon. Remember my words, you will dance at your granddaughter's wedding," she said. After treating the wounds on her legs, Cynthia went to Bruce's room to have another heart-to-heart talk with him. Approaching the boy, she asked, "Bruce, you do realize that if we have to contest the guardianship, Uncle Jonathan will have to give the necessary testimony, don't you?" He looked at her sadly. "Yes, I understand. But tell me, would that really help? Because I don't want to go home. My stepfather will lock me in the basement for what happened. Or worse, he'll call a guard. Uncle Johnny helped me that time. He broke the bars so I could climb out the window. And then we went for a walk together. We went to the park. It was Uncle Johnny who brought me here and said he'd be back soon." At this point, Cynthia suddenly realized that perhaps Johnny could have been hurt by Mr. Jonathan's helpers. After all, if he was connected with crime, what would it take for him to set people up to give the tramp a good beating? Deciding to consult her husband first, Cynthia called to ask how the investigation into Johnny was going. Kevin didn't answer right away. There was a clear irritation in his voice, which was due to the fact that he clearly did not want to talk to Cynthia. "Look, what do you want? You're worried about your tramp. He's alive and well in the prison hospital. He'll get a little sneeze, and then he'll be ready for questioning. I'm sure he'll crack," Kevin said. "It wasn't his fault. I know that for a fact," Cynthia said carefully. Her husband chuckled. "You know, I wonder how you know all this. Are you in bed with him? Maybe he whispered something to you the night you operated on him." Cynthia wrinkled her nose. "No, he didn't whisper anything to me. It's just that you think there's something wrong with the boy. Well, he's fine. And I can say that with confidence to anyone, anywhere." Kevin's voice suddenly sounded suspicious. "Listen, do you know where that boy is? Well, you tell Mr. Jonathan, and he might put you back in the clinic for it. You know he's on good terms with the head doctor. One word from him, and you'll be back in the state. Just tell me, where's that little ragamuffin hiding?" "No, Kevin. I don't think we're going to have this conversation. I'm going to go to the police. And I'd advise your Jonathan to get a good lawyer," Cynthia said. The husband was about to launch into an angry tirade, but he saw that the screen of the smartphone had faded, indicating that she had disconnected the call. "My wife has never done this before. Look how brave she's become. I'll have to tell my mother to rein her in. Look at her. She's completely out of control. She has forgotten who put her in that private clinic for a lot of money," the businessman muttered. Few people knew that in fact Kevin had long been dependent on Mr. Jonathan, who helped him in his business by providing him with some investments to keep him afloat. In return, Kevin had to run all sorts of unpleasant errands. One of these errands was an attempt on the vagrant Johnny, who unwittingly contributed to the escape of his stepson from Jonathan's house. Naturally, Kevin himself did not take part in the attack. He hired people, recently released from prison, to teach the vagrant a lesson. They agreed to do it for a fairly small amount of money. After all, at that time they were in dire need of money. Unfortunately, during the conversation they overreacted, and it came to violence. That's when one of them stabbed Johnny. I guess the conversation didn't work out. Naturally, after the incident, Mr. Jonathan had a big row with Kevin, calling him a fool who couldn't be trusted with anything. Mr. Jonathan was also afraid that Johnny might remember Kevin's helpers and lead the police to them. But Mr. Jonathan controlled his stepson for good reason. He was the main beneficiary of his mother's inheritance. Jonathan had already been a trustee by all the papers, who could not fully dispose of his stepson's money, therefore, and tried to keep the boy in a golden cage, controlling his every move. Of course, Bruce was not a serious danger to Jonathan now, but children grow up fast. What would happen in 5 or 10 years? By then, Jonathan would have raised a dutiful stepson who would give him all his savings when he came of age, and if Bruce grew up to be willful, it would be a complete failure for Jonathan. After talking to her husband, Cynthia was convinced that he was no help, so she decided to spend the night in Mrs. Amanda's outbuilding, and the next morning go to the police. Not alone, but with Bruce, who was to give the necessary evidence while she waited for the morning. The night dragged on like rubber, bringing the inexorable hour of reckoning for Mr. Jonathan and company. What was the surprise of the police when they saw the boy they had been looking for the second day on the doorstep? Bruce smiled sweetly and talked about how he had never been kidnapped. And Uncle Johnny actually helped him. "Look, maybe he's lying about all this," the duty officer asked Cynthia. Cynthia smiled enigmatically. "I don't know. Can you ask him yourself? I think Bruce is telling the truth." "Yes, he is. Uncle Johnny helped me, but my stepfather, Uncle Jonathan, he's really bad. He wouldn't let me go out. So I don't want to go back to him anymore," Bruce said. "He also hurt me and probably seems to have poisoned my mum," Bruce stated. The desk clerk shook his head and then called for the head of operations. This is where Cynthia realized she had done the right thing by contacting law enforcement. Soon a special officer was called for the boy, who was able to find a common language with children. and thanks to this, he quite quickly found out from Bruce everything that the investigation needed. On the same day, Mr. Jonathan was arrested. However, the law enforcers did not manage to keep him in custody for long. After all, on the same day the lawyer made a solid bail for him, but this personally Cynthia did not care. After all, she had achieved the most important thing. Now Bruce will no longer live with his stepfather, who faces trial in real term. Having learned about what his wife Cynthia had done, Kevin was really furious. What does she think she's doing? Does she really want to put me in a nunnery? Jonathan would eat me alive for these tricks, he complained to his mother, Mrs. Kimberly. Mrs. Kimberly thought for a moment. Well, if that's the case, son, I think we ought to be on the safe side. You know, you should file for divorce before it's too late. If Jonathan gives you a hard time, you tell him I haven't had a relationship with my wife in a long time. She's not in her right mind, said Mrs. Amanda indignantly. Cynthia hasn't recovered from her dismissal. She does as she pleases. Kevin's eyes twinkled with a sly twinkle. His mother's suggestion certainly appealed to him. And that same day he filed for divorce from Cynthia. Thanks to the testimony of Cynthia and little Bruce, Johnny was cleared of all charges that same day. And homeless Johnny was also transferred to a normal hospital, where he received good care and therapeutic therapy. After Mr. Jonathan's case, the investigation led to the head doctor, Mr. Miles, and the head of the department at the Avicenna Clinic. The couple were now facing criminal penalties that would put an end to their careers as they tried to cover their tracks. Mr. Miles called Cynthia and urged her to come back to work. Except she didn't want to. Instead, she returned to the very city hospital where her career began. There she was able to nurse Johnny, chatting with him about everything in the world. Also, without too much trouble, she was able to arrange with the superintendent for Mrs. Amanda to be placed in one of the wards for intensive therapy. Luckily, this had paid off and her grandmother was slowly on the mend. Cynthia, on the other hand, had a divorce ahead of her, which was arranged by her husband Kevin. The thing was that Kevin decided to leave Cynthia without a house, which was purchased with their joint money. Not only that, in fact, she gave a large sum of money from her own pocket to pay off the mortgage, but Kevin had tactfully kept quiet about it. What was the businessman's surprise when in court he saw next to Cynthia little Bruce and Johnny, who had been discharged from the hospital and was now going to stand up to the end for his saviors. Even a good family law attorney didn't help Kevin that day. In fact, when the boy Bruce told of how and what Cynthia had helped him with, everyone present could not hold back the tears. It was only now that the true extent of Mr. Jonathan and Kevin's scam became clear. Without knowing it himself, the husband had awakened forces that affected not only the boss, but himself as well. Soon all of his associates who had attempted to murder Johnny were apprehended under the pressure of irrefutable evidence. They testified, and Kevin went straight from the courtroom in the divorce case to the detention center. Cynthia, on the other hand, left the court as a winner. Johnny was on her left hand and Bruce on her right. They were met outside by Mrs. Amanda and little Elizabeth, who was holding a bunch of wild flowers. Cynthia smiled and caught herself thinking that it had been a long time since she had felt as good as she did now. That afternoon they had taken many walks and enjoyed what each other had. They had also talked with Johnny about what day they would choose to have their wedding. In the end, they agreed that they would have the wedding on Bruce's mother's birthday, thus giving the baby a kind of gift. After a noisy celebration, Cynthia and Johnny adopted both Bruce and Elizabeth as guardians. The whole family, along with grandmother Mrs. Amanda, moved into Bruce's mother's house. Johnny took a driving course and got his license and became a taxi driver. Bruce and Elizabeth go to school together.